The smell of damp stone and burning oak curls through the narrow streets as the morning mist rises off the Tiber River. Frost clings to the shadows of broken marble columns, a cold reminder of an empire that has long since crumbled into dust. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I am glad you are here. If stepping into these forgotten worlds helps you rest, consider subscribing for more. Now, let us drift back to the year 1000, stepping into the life of a city built for 1,000,000 but occupied by only a handful of resilient survivors. You open your eyes to a pale gray light filtering through the single shuttered window of your small room. The air carries the sour tang of wet earth mixed with the inescapable scent of the river winding through the valley below. You are lying on a straw-stuffed pallet that crinkles faintly with every shift of your weight, the rough wool blanket still holding the last of your body heat. The floor beneath your bare feet is gritty and cold as you step away from the mattress. This is your home on the second floor of a cramped stone and timber building, wedged into an alley so narrow it blocks the sun. You pull a coarse undyed wool tunic over your head and cinch it tightly with a simple leather belt. The stairs leading down to the ground floor creak under your feet, echoing sharply in the confined space. You hear the low murmur of your household beginning to stir, accompanied by the familiar hacking coughs that come from living with indoor wood smoke. A faint orange glow escapes the hearth, where the senior woman of the house is coaxing a small fire back to life. She feeds dry tinder into the embers until a flame catches and casts dancing shadows against the soot-stained ceiling. You step past the living area and push open the heavy wooden door into the chill of an autumn morning. The street greets you with a thin stream of murky water running down its center and the distant harsh sound of a rooster greeting the dawn. You look up and see a skyline dominated not by grand domes, but by the stark vertical lines of fortified clan towers. These stone fortresses rise above the cramped rooftops, bristling with defensive slits and wooden bridges connecting the upper levels. You recognize the colors of a minor noble family hanging limply from a window high above, guarded by men lingering near the reinforced door at street level. Rival clans have turned their neighborhoods into armed camps, ready to barricade the lanes at the first sign of trouble. You keep your head down and adjust your path to avoid the most contested intersections. The political tension in this shrunken city is a physical force that shapes every journey you undertake. A deep bronze note rolls across the rooftops, followed a moment later by another bell answering from a different direction. Within seconds, the morning air fills with a ragged and beautiful chorus of overlapping chimes, announcing the hour of prime. You listen to the sound wash over the ancient ruins and medieval brickwork, a reminder of the hundreds of churches packed into this bend of the river. You navigate the winding paths instinctively, guided by the familiar tolling rather than any street signs. A stray cat watches your progress from a precarious wooden balcony jutting out over the alleyway. You reach the small piazza, where the neighborhood well sits surrounded by worn paving stones. You lower a wooden bucket into the well, feeling the rough hemp rope slide freely through your calloused hands. The splash echoes faintly from the darkness below before you haul the heavy container back up hand over hand. You pour the clear, cold water into your clay jug, noticing the slight mineral scent that accompanies the city's shallow water table. The great ancient aqueducts that once brought millions of gallons of mountain water lie in shattered ruins across the distant fields. You rely on this localized source, knowing the muddy Tiber is best left for washing and turning the floating grain mills. You hoist the jug onto your hip and begin the return walk through the waking streets. Back inside your dwelling, the household gathers around a scarred wooden table for the first meal of the day. You tear off a chunk of dense rye and spelt bread, its thick crust resisting your fingers before giving way. You dip the coarse bread into a small cup of watered wine, softening the grain and taking comfort in the sharp, familiar taste. A small bowl of cooked fava beans sits in the center of the table, offering a meager but essential source of sustenance. You eat in relative silence, chewing the tough food while observing the erratic shadows cast by the hearth fire. This simple fare provides the necessary energy for the physical labor that awaits you. You leave the house again and set off towards your workshop, walking a path that cuts straight through the bones of antiquity. You pass a massive triumphal arch half buried in centuries of accumulated dirt, its faded carvings barely visible under the grime. A blacksmith has set up his anvil beneath the towering marble columns of an old pagan temple, the rhythmic strikes of his hammer ringing out into the morning. You watch him work the glowing iron, indifferent to the classical grandeur sheltering his humble trade. The people of this city do not revere the past. They recycle it to survive the present. You step over a threshold made from a repurposed gravestone and enter your own workspace. The heavy scent of tanned hides, beeswax, and rendering fat hits your nose the moment you step into the cramped shop. You take your place at a sturdy wooden bench worn smooth by years of repetitive motion. You arrange your tools meticulously, laying out iron awls, sharp curved knives, and heavy needles beside a stack of raw material. You select a thick piece of cured hide and begin to measure it for a new belt, your fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The leather resists the blade slightly, requiring a firm and steady pressure that sends a familiar ache up your forearm. You settle into the unhurried rhythm of the craft, losing yourself in the tactile satisfaction of making something useful. Outside the open doorway of your shop, the city's commerce begins to flow in a bustling, chaotic stream. A farmer drives a donkey burdened with bundled firewood past your window, shouting hoarse commands to keep the beast moving. You pause your cutting to watch a group of women carrying baskets of root vegetables toward the central market near the river. The morning mist burns away, replaced by a weak but welcome sunlight that warms the damp stones of the alley. You pick up a length of waxed linen thread and thread your needle, preparing to join two pieces of leather with tight, even stitches. The repetitive nature of the task calms your mind, anchoring you firmly in the present moment. You notice the crunch of boots on the street outside and catch sight of a merchant wearing a vibrant blue wool cloak. He is a rare splash of color in a world dominated by grays, browns, and undyed fabrics, signaling his wealth to anyone paying attention. You glance down at your own stained tunic and utilitarian turn shoes, feeling no particular envy for his expensive garments. You push the heavy needle through the layered leather, pulling the thread taut until it bites slightly into your fingers. You repeat the motion again and again, the deliberate pulling and tightening forming a durable seam that will outlast its wearer. You are a small but necessary part of this sprawling, fractured community, binding things together while the world outside slowly falls apart. Mid-morning arrives with the tolling of the terce bells, marking another shift in the day's progression. You stand and stretch your back, feeling the stiffness accumulate between your shoulder blades from hunching over the bench. You walk to the doorway and take a deep breath of the outside air, filtering the scent of roasting meat coming from a nearby cookshop. The hunger returns, a low rumble in your stomach, but you know the midday meal is still hours away. You rub a dollop of grease into your hands to protect the skin from the harsh tanning chemicals before returning to your stool. You pick up the next piece of work, a sturdy pouch for a traveler, and begin the rigorous process of shaping the leather. You catch the unmistakable clatter of a cartwheel grinding against the uneven paving stones of the main thoroughfare. The noise is loud and jarring, a stark contrast to the muted footsteps and voices that usually fill this narrow side street. You look up from your stitching just in time to see a heavy wooden wagon loaded with rough-hewn timber struggling around the corner. The driver curses loudly, cracking a whip over the backs of two exhausted oxen whose hooves slip on the wet cobbles. You watch the procession inch forward, marveling at the sheer physical effort required to move basic materials through this labyrinthine city. You wait until the racket fades into the distance before resuming your precise, delicate work with the awl. The leather yields to the sharp point of the iron tool, allowing the needle to follow seamlessly through the newly made hole. You fall into a meditative trance, the physical world shrinking down to the square foot of workspace directly in front of you. You notice the tiny variations in the grain of the hide, the subtle differences in thickness that require you to adjust your tension. You understand the material intuitively, knowing exactly how much force it can take before tearing and how it will age over the coming years. You are a master of this small domain, exercising control over your craft in the city where everything else feels dangerously unpredictable. You pull the final stitch tight, tie off the thread, and set the finished pouch onto the growing pile beside you. A sudden gust of wind sweeps down the alley, carrying a handful of dry leaves and the sharp chill of approaching winter. You pull the capuccio forward over your head, grateful for the thick wool that shields your neck from the draft. The weather in this valley is notoriously fickle, shifting from pleasant warmth to biting cold in the span of a single morning. You walk over to a small brazier sitting in the corner of the shop and stir the glowing coals with an iron rod to generate a bit more heat. The warmth radiates outward, easing the stiffness in your knuckles and bringing a flush of color back to your pale hands. You return to your bench, picking up a dull blade and running it rhythmically across a whetstone until the edge gleams sharp in silver. You ignore commotion near the fountain square, the sound of raised voices echoing off the stone facades. It is likely just a disagreement over the price of salt or a dispute regarding right-of-way between two stubborn cart drivers. You do not leave your bench to investigate, knowing that idle curiosity often leads to unnecessary involvement in other people's grievances. You test the newly sharpened knife against a scrap of waste leather, slicing through the material with barely any resistance. You nod in satisfaction and begin to cut the patterns for a pair of heavy winter boots commissioned by a local merchant. You trace the lines carefully, making sure to maximize the yield from the expensive hide while avoiding the flawed sections near the edges. The sunlight creeps across the dirt floor of your workshop, marking the march of time without the need for a clock. You sweep away the accumulated leather shavings and dust, maintaining a clean area to prevent the valuable materials from becoming soiled. You reach for a small pot of dark dye and a stiff bristled brush, ready to treat the edges of the freshly cut boot pieces. You apply the pigment with smooth, even strokes, watching the pale leather absorb the liquid and turn a rich, deep brown. The smell of the dye is pungent and earthy, lingering in the confined space long after the pot is sealed shut. You set the pieces aside on a wooden rack to dry, satisfied with the progress you have made since the morning bells. The shadow of the building across the street lengthens, indicating that the hour of sext is approaching and the morning is nearly spent. You wipe the excess dye from your hands using a ragged cloth, though the dark stains on your skin are permanent fixtures of your trade. You take a moment to survey the neat stacks of raw material, finished goods, and organized tools that represent your livelihood. You feel a profound sense of continuity, knowing that your hands are performing the exact same tasks that craftsmen have executed in this city for generations. You reach for a leather water skin hanging from a peg, uncork it, and take a long drink to clear the dust from your throat. You secure the cork, wipe your mouth with the back of your wrist, and prepare to face the second half of the day. You step outside the workshop momentarily to stretch your legs before the midday heat settles into the narrow alleyways. A stray dog trots past, its ribs showing through a patchy coat, nose to the ground in a desperate search for discarded scraps. You watch it disappear around the corner of a ruined bathhouse, an ancient structure now serving as a makeshift stable for passing merchants. The air hums with the distant overlapping voices from the central marketplace, a chaotic symphony of haggling and hawking echoing off the stone walls. You lean against the timber doorframe of your shop, feeling the rough grain of the wood press firmly against your spine. You observe the endless stream of survival and struggle that defines this era, knowing you must soon return to your bench and pull your own weight. A group of barefoot children runs past your doorway, chasing a hoop made from a broken barrel ring with enthusiastic shouts. You smile faintly at their brief display of carefree energy, a fleeting luxury in a world that demands hard labor almost from birth. You turn back into the dim interior of the shop, the transition from sunlight to shadow, forcing your eyes to adjust for a few long seconds. You retrieve a heavy mallet and a set of iron stamps, preparing to decorate the surface of a thick leather scabbard. You align the first stamp carefully against the edge of the hide, gripping the iron shaft tightly to prevent it from slipping. You bring the mallet down with a sharp, controlled strike, leaving a perfect geometric impression permanently debossed into the tough material. You lift the iron tool and inspect the clean edge of the stamped design under the slanting light. The leather holds the shape perfectly, a small testament to the strength in your arms and the quality of the hide. You strike again, establishing a steady, rhythmic thud that bleeds into the background noise of the alley outside. A drop of sweat traces a path down your temple, catching the dust suspended in the warm midday air. The sun has climbed to its highest point, baking the dampness out of the stone walls and replacing it with a stifling, heavy heat. You wipe your forehead with the back of your wrist, leaving a smudge of dark dye across your skin. The workshop feels suddenly claustrophobic, pressing in on you with the smells of rendered fat and harsh tanning liquor. Heat radiates from the cobblestones beyond the open doorway, distorting the air above the narrow street. A stray dog pants in the thin strip of shade beneath a wooden awning, its ribs rising and falling in rapid succession. The central market is reaching its peak frenzy, a chaotic symphony of shouting merchants and braying pack animals drifting over the rooftops. Hunger gnaws at your stomach again, a persistent ache that the morning's coarse bread and beans can no longer pacify. You set the heavy mallet onto the scarred bench, deciding the scabbard can wait an hour while you seek out a proper meal. The tools are arranged with practiced care. Iron awls and curved blades align neatly against the timber wall. You step out into the blinding glare of the early afternoon, squinting against the harsh Roman sun. The alleyway is crowded with bodies pressing past one another, a shifting mass of coarse wool, linen, and sweat. You weave through the throng with the instinctive grace of a lifelong resident, anticipating the sudden stops and abrupt turns of your neighbors. A woman balancing a wide, flat basket of onions on her head brushes past your shoulder, her dark eyes focused intently on the path ahead. You alter your course toward the river, seeking both food and the slight breeze that occasionally follows the water's sluggish current. The ancient pavement beneath your thin shoes is uneven, cratered by centuries of heavy carts and neglected maintenance. You listen to the overlapping dialects mixing in the heavy air, a coarse, guttural evolution of Latin that shapes the daily life of the city. A seller of roasted chickpeas bellows his prices from a corner stall, waving a wooden spoon to attract the attention of passing laborers. You toss him a small worn copper coin, catching a cone of folded parchment filled with the hot salted legumes. The heat of the roasted food seeps through the paper, warming your palm as you continue your walk toward the Tiber. You toss a few chickpeas into your mouth, chewing the starchy, salty morsels while navigating a pile of shattered terracotta roof tiles blocking half the lane. Survival here demands constant awareness, a quiet vigilance that maps every hazard and opportunity without conscious thought. Above the crowded lanes, the fortified towers of the rival noble clans cast long, hard shadows across the brickwork. Guards in earth-toned tunics lean against the heavy, iron-reinforced doors of a nearby family compound, their hands resting casually on the hilts of their swords. The tension between the gray houses is a tangible weight pressing down on the neighborhood, a silent threat that dictates where you walk and who you acknowledge. You lower your gaze as you pass their territory, chewing your food and focusing strictly on the uneven ground. A sudden clash of steel would not be unusual here, and bystanders are rarely spared when the blood feuds boil over into the streets. The political reality of Rome is brutal, measured in walled compounds and armed men rather than laws and senates. You reach the muddy banks of the Tiber River, where the smell of silt and decay thickens the humid air. Dozens of flat-bottomed floating mills are anchored in the current, their massive wooden wheels churning the brown water into white foam. The grinding of the massive millstones creates a low, vibrating roar that rattles in your chest and drowns out the chatter of the city. You watch a muscular miller balancing on a narrow wooden plank, guiding a heavy sack of grain from a skiff onto the floating platform. The river is the industrial heart of the surviving population. Processing the daily bread while simultaneously acting as an open sewer, you swallow the last of your chickpeas, washing them down with a swig from your water skin, avoiding any temptation to drink from the turbid river. You cross the Pons Elias, the ancient bridge leading toward the massive cylindrical bulk of the Castel Sant'Angelo. The stone parapets are crowded with vendors selling small fish caught in wicker traps downstream, their silver scales flashing in the afternoon light. You maneuver through the crush of bodies, sliding past a group of foreign pilgrims who are staring up at the fortress with wide, exhausted eyes. Their woolen cloaks are gray with the dust of 100 distant roads, marking them as outsiders in this insular, suspicious landscape. You pay them little mind, your attention fixed on a merchant displaying rough linen cloth woven in the countryside. You run your fingers over the stiff fabric, assessing its durability for lining the leather pouches you produce in your shop. By mid-afternoon, the oppressive heat begins to soften into a heavy golden warmth that bathes the ancient ruins. The harsh shadows stretch and blur, transforming the jagged silhouettes of broken columns into softer, more forgiving shapes. A slow procession of monks moves chanting across the distant bridge, their dark robes blending into the shaded archways of the Theater of Marcellus. You finalize the purchase of the linen, trading a small silver denarius for a modest bolt of the undyed material. The merchant bites the coin out of habit, nods curtly, and shoves it into a leather purse tied securely to his belt. The transaction is blunt and wordless, a standard exchange in a market where trust is scarce and currency is frequently clipped. You balance the bolt of linen on your shoulder, feeling the rough weave scratch against the exposed skin of your neck. The walk back to your workshop takes you past the sprawling construction site where a new church is being grafted onto the bones of a pagan temple. You pause to watch the laborers hoisting a massive block of reclaimed travertine using a complex array of ropes and wooden pulleys. The air rings with the sharp, rhythmic chipping of chisels as stonecutters shape geometric patterns from shattered imperial marble. You observe a master craftsman kneeling on the dirt floor, carefully fitting a triangle of red porphyry into a mosaic pavement. The city is constantly devouring its own past to build its present, a relentless cycle of destruction and creation that defines the Roman era. You catch the sharp scent of quicklime mixing with damp earth, a smell that signals the mortar being prepared in deep wooden troughs. Two young apprentices covered in white dust stir the heavy mixture with long wooden poles, their faces pale and ghost-like in the shadows. You adjust the weight of the linen on your shoulder, feeling a twinge of sympathy for the grueling, repetitive labor they must endure. The physical toll of building in the city is immense, written into the bent spines and calloused hands of every man working the site. You turn away from the construction and resume your pace, the narrow streets welcoming you back into their familiar, labyrinthine embrace. The sun dips slightly lower, signaling the slow approach of the late afternoon. The heavy timber door of your workshop groans on its iron hinges as you push it open and step back into the dim interior. The air inside is cooled slightly, retaining the musky scent of leather and dye that defines your livelihood. You set the bolt of linen onto a sturdy wooden shelf, unwrapping the protective outer layer to inspect your purchase more closely. The fabric is coarse but strong, perfectly suited to line the heavy winter boots commissioned by the wealthy merchant. You take your seat at the scarred workbench, picking up the heavy mallet and the iron stamp to resume your interrupted task. The rhythm of the work settles over you once again, a comforting routine that anchors your mind against the chaos outside. You strike the iron tool with measured force, continuing the geometric pattern along the edge of the thick leather scabbard. The mallet falls with a satisfying thud, each blow indenting the hide with precision, born of 1,000 similar strikes. You rotate the leather slowly, keeping the line straight and the spacing even, your eyes tracking the faint guide marks etched into the surface. A sliver of late afternoon sunlight pierces the small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air above your bench. You pause briefly to wipe the sweat from your brow, feeling the familiar ache spreading through your shoulders and down your back. The physical exertion is a constant companion, a dull ache that signifies a day of productive, honest labor. You think about the pilgrims you passed on the bridge, their faces etched with the profound exhaustion of their long journey. Their desperate faith drives them across dangerous lands, risking disease and bandits just to touch a fragment of bone housed in a silver reliquary. You respect their devotion while harboring a quiet, practical skepticism about the authenticity of the countless relics scattered across the city's altars. The business of salvation is a lucrative trade here, sustaining hostelers, guides, and the very church that governs your daily life. You push these thoughts aside, focusing your attention back on the tangible reality of the leather and iron beneath your hands. The spiritual economy is beyond your control, but the quality of your craftsmanship remains firmly within your grasp. Footsteps approach the open doorway of your shop, the heavy tread of leather boots announcing a visitor before they step into the light. A broad-shouldered man wearing a stained tunic and carrying a wooden bucket pauses at the threshold, blocking the slanting rays of the sun. It is the tanner from the district near the river, arriving to deliver a fresh batch of cured hides you requested earlier in the week. The smell of his trade precedes him, a pungent, eye-watering odor of ammonia and animal fat that clings to his skin and clothing. You set down your mallet and rise to greet him, gesturing toward an empty corner of the room where the bundle can be deposited. The transaction is brief and unceremonious, an exchange of copper coins for raw materials that fuels the microeconomy of your neighborhood. You unroll the stiff hides on the dirt floor, running your hands over the surface to check for flaws or inconsistent tanning. The texture is rough but acceptable, lacking the supple quality of expensive cordovan, but perfectly adequate for the utilitarian goods your customers demand. You note a few thin spots near the belly edges, mentally calculating how to cut the patterns to avoid the weaker sections of the leather. The tanner watches you with crossed arms, offering no apologies for the imperfections, knowing that raw materials are scarce and demand remains steady. You nod your approval, sealing the deal with a firm handshake that transfers a trace of his foul-smelling trade onto your own palms. He turns and walks back out into the street, leaving you alone with the heavy scent of your newly acquired stock. You haul the heavy bundle of leather onto a sturdy wooden rack, organizing the hides by thickness and shade to streamline your future projects. Your hands are slick with residual fat and dye, prompting you to scrub them vigorously with a piece of rough cloth and a handful of dry sand. The abrasive grit scours the worst of the stains from your calloused skin, leaving your fingers raw but relatively clean. You toss the soiled cloth into a corner and walk to the small clay basin holding your drinking water, splashing a few drops onto your face to cool down. The water is tepid and tastes faintly of clay, but it soothes the dryness in your throat and washes away the accumulated dust. The day is stretching long, the shadows deepening as the sun begins its steady descent toward the horizon. Golden light pours through the narrow gaps between the buildings, casting long, exaggerated silhouettes across the uneven paving stones. The intensity of the midday heat has finally broken, replaced by a softer, more forgiving warmth that signals the transition into late afternoon. The chaotic noise of the central market begins to subside, the frantic haggling giving way to the rhythmic clatter of merchants packing away their unsold wares. Swallows dart through the sky above the alleyways, hunting insects in the cooling air with sudden, erratic bursts of speed. You stand in the doorway of your shop, watching the shifting light transform the grim, dirty street into something briefly, unexpectedly beautiful. The harsh edges of the ruined city are softened by the amber glow, masking the decay beneath a temporary veneer of gold. You notice your neighbor, an elderly woman who weaves rough linen, sitting on a low wooden stool outside her door with a spindle in her hands. Her fingers move with a blind, automatic precision, twisting the flax fibers into a continuous thread while her eyes stare blankly down the street. You offer a small, respectful nod, which she returns without breaking the rhythm of her spinning, a silent acknowledgement shared between two people bound by perpetual labor. Her face is a map of deep wrinkles weathered by decades of Roman sun and the relentless grinding poverty of the artisan class. You look away, humbled by her enduring stamina, and step back into the shadows of your workshop to prepare for the final hours of daylight. The scabbard on your bench still requires a finishing coat of wax to protect the leather from the dampness of the coming winter. You scoop a small lump of hardened beeswax from a clay jar, warming it between your palms until it softens into a pliable paste. You rub the wax vigorously into the debossed surface of the scabbard, using a piece of dense felt to generate heat and force the protective layer deep into the pores. The leather darkens immediately, taking on a rich, polished sheen that highlights the precision of your geometric stamping. You work the material methodically, your arms moving in tight, rapid circles until the entire surface is coated and buffed to a dull luster. The scent of the melting wax mixes with the ambient smells of the shop, a surprisingly sweet aroma that briefly overpowers the lingering odor of the tanner's delivery. You hold the finished piece up to the light, inspecting the smooth, water-resistant finish with a critical eye. Sparks fly from the blacksmith's forge down the street, briefly visible through the gathering gloom as he brings his hammer down on the glowing horseshoe. The metallic ringing cuts through the evening air, a steady, driving pulse that measures the remaining minutes of the working day. You lay the completed scabbard onto the drying rack, satisfied that the thick leather will shield a blade from the corrosive damp of the Roman autumn. The tools scattered across your bench demand attention, requiring cleaning and sharpening before the fading light makes the task impossible. You begin gathering the awls, knives, and stamps, wiping each iron implement with an oiled rag to prevent the creeping rust that plagues metal in this humid river valley. The day's labor is winding to a close, the physical output of your hands transforming raw hide into practical survival. You arrange the polished tools in a sturdy wooden box, fitting each blade into its designated slot with practiced care. The shop floor is littered with tiny scraps of leather and discarded trimmings, debris that must be swept away to maintain order in the cramped space. You grab a broom made of bound twigs and sweep the dirt floor, pushing the refuse into a neat pile near the doorway for disposal. The physical exertion of sweeping pulls at the tired muscles in your lower back, a dull, persistent reminder of the hours spent hunched over the workbench. You gather the scraps into a leather apron and toss them into a wicker basket, ensuring the workspace is immaculate and ready for tomorrow's inevitable demands. You take a final look around the dim room, checking that nothing of value is left exposed to the damp night air. You grab the heavy wooden shutters and pull them firmly across the narrow window, plunging the workshop into deep, sudden shadow. The iron latch falls into place with a definitive clack, sealing the room against the encroaching chill and the unseen dangers of the coming night. You secure the main door with a thick oak bar, sliding it into the iron brackets mounted on the stone walls with a heavy scrape. The shop is locked down, the day's labor contained within the silent, darkened walls until the morning bells ring again. You step away from the workbench, your body heavy with the accumulated fatigue of honest work and the lingering heat of the fading afternoon. The transition from labor to rest begins now, a slow unwinding of tension as you prepare to return to your household. Silence settles heavily over the small workshop, broken only by the faint, muffled sounds of the street filtering through the thick timber walls. The darkness inside is absolute, a thick, unyielding blackness that forces you to navigate the familiar space entirely by touch and memory. Your hand brushes against the rough edge of the workbench, guiding you toward the internal door that leads to the narrow staircase connecting your shop to the living quarters above. The stairs creak loudly under your weight, each step a testament to the age and fragility of the medieval structure. You climb slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the faint flickering light bleeding out from the hearth fire on the second floor. The smells of the evening meal greet you, a heavy aroma of boiled cabbage and salted pork that promises relief from your lingering hunger. You lift the iron tool and inspect the clean edge of the stamped design under the slanting light of the fading afternoon. The leather holds the shape perfectly, a small testament to the strength in your arms and the quality of the hide. You strike again, establishing a steady, rhythmic thud that bleeds into the background noise of the alley outside. A drop of sweat traces a path down your temple, catching the dust suspended in the warm air. The sun has begun its steep descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the damp cobblestones. You wipe your forehead with the back of your wrist, leaving a smudge of dark dye across your skin. The workshop feels suddenly claustrophobic, pressing in on you with the heavy smells of rendered fat and harsh tanning liquor. Heat radiates from the stone walls beyond the open doorway, distorting the air above the narrow street. A stray dog pants in the thin strip of shade beneath a wooden awning, its ribs rising and falling in rapid succession. The central market is beginning to lose its frenzy, the chaotic symphony of shouting merchants shifting into the rhythmic clatter of packing crates and breaking down stalls. Hunger gnaws at your stomach again, a persistent ache that the morning's coarse bread and beans can no longer pacify. You set the heavy mallet onto the scarred bench, deciding the scabbard can wait while you secure the shop for the evening. The tools are arranged with practiced care, iron awls and curved blades aligned neatly against the timber wall. You pull the heavy timber shutters across the narrow window of your workshop, sealing out the fading light with a definitive clack of the iron latch. The air inside cools almost instantly, trapping the musky scent of leather and dye within the confined space. You secure the main door with a thick oak bar, sliding it into the iron brackets mounted on the stone walls with a heavy scrape. The shop is locked down, the day's labor contained within the silent, darkened walls until the morning bells ring again. You step toward the internal door that leads to the narrow staircase connecting your shop to the living quarters above. The stairs creak loudly under your weight, each step a testament to the age and fragility of the medieval structure. You climb slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the faint, flickering light bleeding out from the hearth fire on the second floor. You step off the top stair and enter the main living space of your household, where the thick smell of boiling root vegetables immediately envelops you. The room is hazy with wood smoke failing to properly draft through the small opening near the ceiling, stinging your eyes with familiar persistence. Your wife stands over the stone hearth, stirring an iron pot with a long wooden spoon, her face illuminated from below by the crackling embers. Two children sit cross-legged on the uneven floorboards, knocking a carved wooden top between them in a muted, repetitive game. You cross the room and take your place on a low bench near the fire, feeling the heat sink into your tired muscles. The transition from the solitary focus of your workshop to the chaotic warmth of the family unit happens in an instant. A rough wooden bowl is passed into your hands, heavy with the weight of the evening stew. The broth is thick with mashed turnips and scattered chunks of salted pork, an expensive luxury purchased for the impending feast day. You dig a piece of stale bread into the dark liquid, letting the porous grain absorb the savory fat before taking your first bite. The salt burns slightly against the cracked skin of your lips, a sharp and welcome sensation that wakes up your exhausted palate. The household eats together in relative silence, the metallic scrape of spoons against wooden bowls serving as the only conversation. The calories are essential, fuel burned today that must be frantically replaced before tomorrow's labor begins. You scrape the last remnants of the stew from the bottom of your bowl, leaving the wood scraped clean and ready to be rinsed. The fire puffs loudly, sending a shower of tiny orange sparks up toward the soot-blackened rafters. Your cousin, a younger man who arrived from the countryside last spring, leans against the far wall and begins to whittle a broken tool handle with a small knife. The shavings fall onto the dirt-packed section of the floor, adding to a pile of kindling that will feed tomorrow's morning flame. You watch the rhythmic motion of his blade, the steady slicing away of excess wood, mimicking the constant whittling down of life in this city. Every action in this room serves a distinct purpose, leaving no space for idle hands or wasted energy. Beyond the heavy timber shutters, the fading daylight drains the color from the Roman sky, replacing the bright azure with a bruised, muddy purple. The swallows have abandoned their hunting patterns, replaced by the erratic fluttering of bats emerging from the ruins of the nearby theater. You can hear the distant, muffled shouting of a late merchant rushing to secure his stall before the shadows claim the central market completely. The temperature outside is dropping rapidly, pulling a sharp draft through the invisible cracks in the mortar of your building. You pull your woolen tunic tighter across your chest, acutely aware of the thin barrier separating your family from the encroaching cold. The city is pulling its limbs inward, bracing for the total obscurity of the medieval night. A single resonant chime strikes from the bell tower of Santa Maria in Trastevere, vibrating through the humid air across the river. It is immediately answered by a deeper, hollow toll from a basilica closer to the ruins of the Forum, signaling the hour of Vespers. The chaotic, overlapping bronze voices wash over the rooftops, a relentless reminder that the church commands the very measurement of time. You instinctively cross yourself, a gesture so deeply ingrained it happens without conscious thought or profound religious feeling. Your wife pauses her scrubbing of the iron pot, bowing her head slightly until the nearest bell ceases its tolling. The daily rhythm of work and prayer binds the fragmented neighborhoods together, offering a fragile illusion of unity against the dark. You rise from the bench and move toward the small wooden chest sitting at the foot of your sleeping pallet. Lifting the heavy lid releases the scent of dried lavender and stale wool, the meager accumulation of your worldly possessions. You retrieve a thick lump of tallow and a length of twisted flax, intending to fashion a crude candle for the upcoming hours. Beeswax is a luxury reserved for the high altars in the palatial homes of the nobility, leaving laborers to rely on the foul-smelling rendered animal fat. You press the string into the center of the soft tallow, molding the greasy substance with your thumbs until it forms a crude, uneven cylinder. The resulting light will be poor and smoky, but it will push back the absolute blackness that threatens to swallow the room. You bring the homemade candle to the hearth, touching the exposed wick to a glowing ember until a tiny, sputtering flame takes hold. The light casts long, trembling shadows across the plastered walls, distorting the shapes of your family members into looming giants. The smell of burning fat immediately fills the confined space, a cloying, heavy odor that mixes unpleasantly with the lingering scent of boiled cabbage. You set the candle onto a flat stone projecting from the masonry, establishing a small perimeter of visibility against the overwhelming dark. The children abandon their wooden top, migrating instinctively toward the meager circle of light, like moths drawn to a lantern. The evening tasks can now commence, illuminated by a flame that requires constant tending to prevent it from drowning in its own melting grease. Your wife pulls a ragged linen shirt from a woven basket, inspecting a large tear near the shoulder seam. She threads a bone needle with practiced efficiency, squinting slightly against the erratic flickering of the tallow flame. You watch her push the needle through the coarse fabric, her fingers moving with a swift, mechanical rhythm that speaks of years of identical repairs. The clothing in this household is patched, repatched, and salvaged until the original garment is completely consumed by the alterations. Fabric is too precious to discard, requiring endless hours of maintenance to stretch the lifespan of every tunic and pair of hose. The silent, tedious labor of the women holds the family together just as surely as the mortar holds the bricks of your dwelling. You realize the water jug sitting near the door is nearly empty, lacking enough fresh water to sustain the household through the night. The curfew bell is not yet rung, giving you a brief window to visit the communal fountain before the streets become legally and physically treacherous. You grab the clay vessel by its thick handle, the fired earth, rough and familiar, against your calloused palm. You unbar the heavy door and step back out onto the landing, the sudden drop in temperature raising goosebumps along your arms. The stairs descend into total blackness, forcing you to feel for each wooden tread with the tip of your leather shoe. You navigate the descent entirely by memory, a spatial awareness forged by countless identical trips in the dark. The alleyway is a trench of pure shadow, the towering walls of the adjacent buildings blocking out the faint light of the rising moon. You step onto the uneven cobblestones, keeping your hand brushing against the cold, damp masonry to maintain your orientation. A rat scurries across your path, its claws clicking sharply against the stone before vanishing into a pile of discarded refuse. The air smells intensely of wet earth and raw sewage, the organic decay amplified by the lack of direct sunlight. You move with deliberate caution, knowing that a twisted ankle in these unseen potholes could mean weeks of lost wages and subsequent starvation. The city at this hour is stripped of its bustling charm, reduced to a hostile maze of blind corners and lurking hazards. You reach the small piazza housing the neighborhood well, finding it deserted except for a lone figure huddled in a dark woolen cloak. You approach the stone basin carefully, the sound of trickling water guiding you through the gloom. The figure turns out to be a young servant boy from a wealthier household, struggling to lift a heavy wooden bucket onto his shoulder. You set your clay jug down and offer a silent hand, helping him hoist the unwieldy container until he finds his balance. He mutters a quick, breathless word of thanks before hurrying away into the darkness, his boots slapping loudly against the wet stones. You are left alone with the ancient, continuously flowing water, a rare moment of profound isolation in a city that usually offers no privacy whatsoever. You dip your jug into the basin, listening to the hollow glug as the cold water displaces the trapped air. The surface of the pool reflects the faint, distorted light of the stars, shivering slightly as your vessel breaks the tension. You pull the heavy jug out, water spilling over the lip and splashing onto your thin leather shoes, sending a shock of cold through your toes. You wipe the excess moisture from the fired clay, hoisting the substantial weight onto your hip to balance the load. The return journey must be made quickly as the shadows deepen and the invisible threats of the Roman night begin to multiply. You turn your back on the fountain, eager to return to the barred door and the smoky warmth of your family's hearth. Halfway up the alley, you hear the sudden, violent crash of pottery shattering against a wall, followed immediately by raised, angry voices. You freeze in your tracks, pressing your back against the damp brickwork to minimize your silhouette in the narrow passage. A man is shouting in the coarse local dialect, his words slurred with cheap wine and heavy with accusations of theft. A woman shrieks a denial, the sound cutting through the humid air with terrifying clarity. You grip the handle of your water jug tighter, calculating whether to intervene or slip past the escalating domestic violence unnoticed. The unspoken rule of the neighborhood dictates non-interference unless blood is drawn, a brutal pragmatism born of the lack of formal justice. You decide to move forward, hugging the opposite wall and keeping your footsteps as silent as the rough terrain allows. You pass the open doorway where the argument is raging, catching a brief, illuminated glimpse of a man raising a heavy wooden stool above his head. You do not stop to watch the impact, accelerating your pace until the shouting fades into a muffled, indistinct rumble behind you. The violence is a common feature of this cramped existence, the inevitable eruption of pressure in a society built on relentless labor and endless proximity. You reach the heavy oak door of your own building, pushing it open with a profound sense of relief. You climb the pitch-black stairs, the familiar creak of the wood signaling your safe return from the perilous edge of the night. You enter the living quarters and immediately slide the heavy iron bolt across the door, securing the physical boundary between your family and the chaos outside. You set the full water jug down near the hearth, the water sloshing heavily against the clay sides. Your wife looks up from her mending, reading the tension in your shoulders without needing to ask what you encountered in the dark. The tallow candle has burned down a fraction of an inch, its waxy perimeter pooling unevenly on the flat stone. The children have abandoned their game entirely, sitting quietly near the fire and staring into the glowing embers with heavy, unfocused eyes. The household is drawing inward, pulling its defensive perimeter tight against the unpredictable terrors of the medieval dark. You move toward the small wooden chest holding your personal tools, wanting to ensure the sharp blades are properly oiled before the dampness ruins the steel. You retrieve a small piece of oiled cloth and a curved leather knife, wiping the metal surface with slow, deliberate strokes. The tool is an extension of your own hand, the handle one smooth and perfectly contoured to the grip of your calloused palm. Maintaining these instruments is not a chore, but a sacred obligation. as they represent the sole means of keeping a roof over your family's head. You inspect the edge under the poor light, satisfied that the blade remains sharp enough to slice cleanly through a thick ox hide. You wrap the knife carefully in the claw, laying it back into the chest alongside your bone needles and iron awls. A deep resonant toll echoes across the city, the sound heavier and more authoritative than the earlier bells of Vespers. It is the Compline bell, the official signal that the day has ended and the strict municipal curfew has begun. Anyone caught roaming the streets now without a torch and a legitimate excuse is subject to the harsh, summary justice of the roaming night watch. The sound seems to vibrate through the stone walls of your dwelling, a physical reminder of the church's ultimate authority over the movement of its flock. You listen as the final reverberation fades into the night, leaving behind a silence that feels suddenly thicker and more oppressive. The city is officially locked down, transitioning from a bustling commercial hub into a vast unlit prison of stone and timber. The fire in the hearth is intentionally allowed to burn down, transitioning from leaping flames to a bed of fiercely glowing coals. Fire is the greatest enemy of the medieval city, a constant threat capable of consuming entire neighborhoods if a stray spark lands on a thatched roof or dry timber. You take a heavy iron poker and bank the ashes over the embers, preserving the heat for the morning while minimizing the risk of a conflagration. The temperature in the room drops almost immediately, the autumn chill seeping through the shuttered window and radiating from the stone walls. You unroll a heavy, scratchy woolen blanket from a chest, shaking out the dust before draping it over the children's pallet. The cold is an enduring adversary, fought nightly with layers of rough fabric and the shared body heat of the crowded family. The room assumes a deeply melancholic atmosphere, defined by the sharp smell of extinguished wood smoke and the lingering, greasy odor of the tallow candle. Shadows dominate the space, retreating only inches from the single, sputtering source of light. You notice the uneven texture of the plastered wall, where generations of inhabitants have patched the crumbling masonry with crude mixtures of mud and lime. A small wooden crucifix hangs slightly askew near the door, a silent guardian watching over the struggling household. You hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of a mouse behind the baseboard, a reminder that you share this dwelling with countless unseen scavengers. The sensory input is muted but persistent, anchoring you firmly to the harsh reality of your physical environment. Your wife bites the linen thread, breaking the line and smoothing the repaired seam of the shirt with her thumb. She folds the garment meticulously, adding it to a small stack of finished mending resting on a wooden stool. The bone needles return to a small leather pouch, an item of significant value that cannot be carelessly misplaced in the clutter. She stands and stretches her back, wincing slightly as the stiff muscles protest the long hours of hunching over the dim light. You meet her eyes briefly, a shared acknowledgement of the day's completion and the collective survival it represents. There is no space for romance or elaborate affection, only the deep, unspoken bond forged by mutual endurance and shared hardship. You walk over to the shuttered window and pry one of the wooden slats back a fraction of an inch, peering out into the void. The street below is entirely invisible, swallowed completely by an absolute blackness that no modern city dweller could ever comprehend. You cannot see the paving stones, the ruined columns, or the fortified tower looming just 50 yards away. The only indication of the world outside is the sound of the wind whistling through the narrow gaps, carrying the faint scent of river mud and distant decay. A lone dog barks somewhere in the direction of the Palatine Hill, a sharp, lonely sound that emphasizes the vast, empty ruin of the former empire. You release the slat, letting the shutter snap firmly back into place. The transition from active labor to enforced stillness is always jarring, leaving a residual energy vibrating in your hands and shoulders. You sit back down on the low bench, leaning forward with your elbows resting heavily on your knees. You trace the dark stains of tanning dye embedded deep in the creases of your palms, mapping the permanent physical toll of your profession. A sudden gust of wind rattles the heavy oak door, testing the strength of the iron hinges and the solid wooden bar. The building groans in response, the ancient timber settling and shifting with the drop in temperature. You listen to the creak of the wood, knowing the structure is sound despite its age, built upon foundations that have stood for a millennium. The tallow candle finally burns down to the stone, the wick collapsing into the pool of melted fat with a sharp hiss. The flame sputters wildly for a moment, drawing frantic, jagged shadows across the ceiling before extinguishing completely. The darkness in the room becomes absolute, plunging the household into a blindness that is both terrifying and deeply familiar. You do not move immediately, allowing your eyes to adjust, though there is nothing left to see. You rely entirely on your other senses, feeling the draft cutting across the floor and smelling the acrid smoke of the dead wick. The absence of light forces the mind inward, closing off the external world and forcing you to confront the stillness of the room. You hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of your children from their pallet, the sound serving as a fragile anchor in the surrounding void. The day has exacted its price in sweat, strain, and anxiety, but it has yielded enough bread and safety to justify the effort. You stand up in the pitch black, navigating the few steps to your own straw-stuffed mattress without hesitation. You sit on the edge of the rough ticking, running your hands over the coarse wool blanket that will serve as your only defense against the cold. The distant sound of the Tiber River murmuring against the stone piers of the bridges drifts through the cracks in the walls. The city is locked away for the night, but the history beneath it remains wide awake, waiting in the shadows. You pause on the edge of the straw ticking, the rough wool of the blanket slipping from your fingers as the atmospheric pressure in the room suddenly drops. A fierce, sudden gust of wind slams against the exterior of the building, rattling the heavy timber shutters on their iron hinges. You stand back up, the instinct for preservation overriding the heavy exhaustion settled deep in your bones. The autumn storms of this river valley arrive without warning, borne over the distant sea and channeled directly through the surrounding hills. A low rumble of thunder reverberates through the ancient foundations beneath your feet, vibrating up through the floorboards. You realize that rest will have to wait until the hostile weather finally breaks. Rain begins to lash against the masonry in heavy, irregular sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the stone. The noise is deafening in the confined space, drowning out the steady breathing of your household and replacing it with a chaotic drumming. Cold air forces its way through the invisible cracks in the mortar, carrying the distinct metallic scent of ozone and wet dust. The building groans under the sudden assault, ancient timbers flexing and settling as the wind searches for a structural weakness. Lightning flashes outside, a brilliant, fractured illumination that bleeds through the narrow gaps in the window slats, throwing stark white lines across the dark room. You move quickly toward the window, navigating the pitch-black space using the mental map forged by years of habitation. You press your hands against the wooden shutters, feeling the tremendous force of the gale pushing back against the iron latch. You pull a thick leather strap from a nearby peg and bind the handles together, wrapping the cord tight to prevent the wood from giving way. The wood is already slick with moisture creeping in from the outside, cold and clammy against your calloused palms. You tie a final knot, anchoring the defense against the elements while the storm continues to rage just inches from your face. A steady dripping sound starts in the far corner of the ceiling, a rhythmic patter that signals a breach in the aging clay roof tiles. Water falls onto the packed dirt floor, creating a muddy depression that will soon spread if left unattended. The smell of the room shifts from stale wood smoke to the rich, loamy scent of wet soil and decaying thatch. Someone shifts on the sleeping pallet, a muffled groan of discomfort as the dampness alters the temperature of the enclosed air. The fragility of the medieval dwelling is exposed, a temporary shelter constantly fighting a losing battle against the indifferent weather. You cross the room with careful sliding steps, reaching into the shadows to locate a wooden bucket normally used for fetching well water. You position the heavy container directly beneath the leak, adjusting it until the falling drops strike the bottom with a hollow, echoing ping. You find a second clay bowl and place it near another encroaching drip, catching the water before it can soak into the stored firewood nearby. You kneel on the cold floor to inspect the perimeter of the room, running your hands along the baseboards to check for rising moisture. The work is tedious and invisible, relying solely on the sensitivity of your fingertips in the absolute dark. You step back toward the hearth, concerned that the descending dampness will extinguish the carefully banked coals you prepared earlier. You take the iron poker and gently scrape away the top layer of gray ash, revealing the angry red pulse of the remaining embers beneath. You feed a handful of dried twigs into the center, blowing softly until a tiny, fragile flame catches the edge of the wood. The meager fire casts a weak, wavering light across the lower half of the room, just enough to reveal the muddy footprints you have tracked across the floor. You hold your hands close to the nascent heat, rubbing your knuckles to ward off the creeping chill. Beyond the thick walls, the Tiber River is swelling with the sudden deluge, its sluggish current transforming into a dangerous, rushing force. The fear of flooding, is a permanent resident in these low-lying neighborhoods, a silent anxiety that flares to life every time the autumn rains fall heavy. Debris from the ancient streets is washing into the drainage channels, clogging the Roman sewers that have not been properly cleared in centuries. The water has nowhere to go but up, rising over the cobblestones and threatening the ground floor workshops of the local artisans. The city holds its breath, enduring the downpour with the fatalistic patience of a population that has seen it all before. You sit on the low wooden stool beside the hearth, accepting that a return to the mattress is out of the question for the foreseeable hours. You retrieve a small, rigid piece of unworked leather from your tool chest, needing a quiet task to occupy your hands while the storm howls outside. You rub a dollop of rendered animal fat into the stiff hide, using the heat from the small fire to soften the stubborn connective tissues. Your thumbs press into the grain, working the grease in tight overlapping circles that slowly transform the material into something pliable. The repetitive motion is a familiar comfort, a grounded reality that stands in stark contrast to the chaotic weather battering the roof. You listen to the sounds of your neighbors shifting in the adjoining building, separated only by a thin partition of brick and crumbling plaster. The muffled thud of a heavy object being moved suggests they are also awake and managing their own leaks in the dead of night. You feel a strange sense of solidarity in the darkness, a shared endurance connecting the thousands of souls huddled in this ruined metropolis. You apply more fat to the leather, your fingers slick and warm despite the falling temperature of the room. You focus strictly on the texture of the hide, allowing the tactile sensation to override the persistent anxiety of the rising river. Thunder cracks directly overhead, a concussive blast that shakes the soot from the rafters and sends it drifting down like black snow. The children stir on their pallet, whimpering softly in the dark as the sudden noise shatters their uneasy rest. The mother murmurs a soothing, wordless melody, her voice barely audible over the relentless drumming of the heavy rain. The smell of ozone is replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of fear, an instinctual reaction to the raw power of the elements. The small fire flickers wildly in the draft, threatening to go out and plunge the room back into total obscurity. You set the oiled leather aside and move quickly to the sleeping pallet, placing a reassuring hand on your youngest child's shoulder. You feel the tremor in their small frame, the physical manifestation of terror induced by the harsh storm. You whisper a quiet reassurance in the coarse local dialect, a promise of safety that you cannot truly guarantee but must offer regardless. You pull the rough wool blanket higher around their neck, tucking the edges tight to trap the vital body heat against the damp air. You remain kneeling beside them until their breathing slows and evens out, returning to the fragile sanctuary of troubled rest. You return to your stool by the fire, picking up the piece of leather and resuming the slow, methodical conditioning. You notice the water in the wooden bucket is rising, the rhythmic pinging sound replaced by a duller, heavier splash as the drops hit the accumulating puddle. You mentally calculate how long it will take to fill, knowing you will have to empty it out the narrow window if the rain does not relent. You stare into the glowing coals, letting your mind drift through the practical necessities of the coming day. You will need to inspect the workshop for water damage, salvage any soaked materials, and repair whatever the wind has broken. The storm maintains its ferocity for hours, a relentless assault that tests the structural integrity of every medieval dwelling in the valley. The streets below are transformed into rushing streams, carrying away the accumulated filth of the market and depositing it in the lower districts. The ancient Roman drains, buried beneath centuries of rubble, struggle to swallow the deluge, causing the filthy water to back up into the alleyways. The temperature continues to drop, carrying the sharp bite of impending frost that threatens the late-season crops outside the city walls. The night stretches out, a seemingly endless expanse of dark and cold that demands constant vigilance from the waking inhabitants. You lift a heavy bucket of rainwater, the wooden handle biting into the callous flesh of your palm as you carry it toward the window. You untie the leather strap securing the shutters, cracking the wood just enough to create a narrow gap against the howling wind. You hoist the container and pour the contents out into the black void, the water instantly snatched away by the powerful gale. You pull the shutters closed again and retie the knot, your face wet from the brief exposure to the driving rain. You set the empty bucket back beneath the leak, the hollow pinging sound resuming its steady, maddening rhythm. You wipe the moisture from your face with the rough sleeve of your tunic, the fabric smelling faintly of lanolin and wood smoke. You return to the hearth, and add another small stick to the fire, nursing the flame to provide a minimum of light and warmth. You pick up the leather once more, your hands moving mechanically over the surface without requiring conscious direction. You feel the material becoming supple and soft, a small victory of human effort over the stubborn resistance of nature. You listen to the storm, waiting for the subtle shift in the wind that will signal its eventual passing. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the sheer intensity of the downpour begins to wane, transitioning from a violent lashing to a steady, heavy drizzle. The thunder rolls away toward the distant Apennine Mountains, a retreating grumble that leaves a ringing silence in its wake. The wind loses its biting edge, shifting from a sustained gale to sporadic, tired gusts that rattle the shutters without real malice. The relief in the room is palpable, a collective exhalation of tension as the immediate threat of destruction slowly recedes. The dripping from the ceiling slows, the interval between drops stretching out into long, quiet pauses. You examine the piece of leather in your hands, the surface now smooth and pliable, ready to be cut and shaped into a durable good. You set it down on the bench, satisfied with the progress made during the long, anxious hours of the watch. You stretch your arms above your head, feeling the satisfying pop of your joints, and the dull ache of fatigue settling deep into your bones. You glance at the sleeping forms of your family, their silhouettes barely visible in the dying light of the embers. You have weathered this sudden crisis, securing the fragile perimeter of your existence for another span of hours. You sweep the scattered wood shavings back into the hearth, tidying the small space in preparation for the eventual dawn. You check the wooden bucket one last time, finding it only a quarter full and no longer in danger of overflowing onto the dirt floor. You stand in the center of the quiet room, the adrenaline of the storm fading and leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. You do not return to the mattress, knowing that the deep night still demands a watchful eye until the true morning breaks. You pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders and settle back onto the stool, your vigil continuing in the cold, damp silence. The smell of the wet clay roof tiles permeates the enclosed space, a thick, earthy aroma that speaks of ancient earth and baked mud. Tiny drafts snake across the uneven floorboards, chilling your bare ankles and forcing you to tuck your feet beneath the rung of the stool. The shadows cast by the dying embers seem to stretch and crawl along the plaster walls, creating an optical illusion born of sheer exhaustion. An owl hoots from the direction of the abandoned forms, a solitary hunter taking advantage of the post-storm quiet to seek out displaced rodents. The city is a vast, interconnected ecosystem of predators and survivors, all waiting for the sun to dictate the next move. You press your fingers against your tired eyelids, rubbing the straining optic nerves that ache from staring into the gloom. You focus on the auditory landscape, separating the sound of the Tiber's rushing current from the localized dripping of the eaves. You map the structural groans of your building, identifying which timbers are bearing the weight of the soaked thatch and which are merely settling into place. You possess an intimate tactile knowledge of this structure, an awareness forged by years of patching, repairing, and enduring its physical flaws. You open your eyes again, shaking off the heavy lethargy that threatens to drag you down into dangerous inattention. You run your thumb along the edge of your jaw, feeling the rough stubble that has sprouted since the previous morning. You consider the tasks that await you in the workshop, mentally prioritizing the cutting of the winter boots over the completion of the stamped scabbard. You know the damp weather will affect the drying time of the dyes and the flexibility of the raw hides, requiring adjustments to your standard techniques. You plan the day with meticulous detail, a survival strategy that leaves nothing to chance in a city where margins are razor thin. You are a craftsman of necessity, engineering your life one deliberate decision at a time while the dark hours slowly bleed away. The dark hours bleed away, giving way to a subtle shift in the air temperature. You feel the distinct, biting chill that always precedes the first light of dawn. The embers in the hearth have burned down to a fragile gray powder, offering almost no heat to the cramped room. You stand up from the low stool, your knees popping loudly in the quiet space. The children are huddled together beneath the coarse wool blanket, their breath forming faint white plumes in the frigid air. You move toward the stack of firewood, selecting 3 dry splits of oak to revive the dying fire. The bark feels rough and familiar against your palms as you arrange the wood over the remaining coals. You crouch low to the ground and blow steadily into the ash, watching the red heart of the fire flare back to life. A thin curl of fragrant smoke rises toward the blackened ceiling, carrying the sharp scent of the forest into the damp room. The flames catch the edge of the oak, crackling softly as they begin to consume the dry timber. You hold your numb hands close to the heat, feeling the painful prickle of returning circulation in your fingertips. The storm has left a pervasive moisture in the air, a heavy dampness that settles into the fibers of your woolen tunic. You listen to the sounds of your neighbors beginning their morning rituals, a chorus of coughs and scraping chairs echoing through the thin masonry walls. A pale, anemic light begins to outline the gaps in the wooden window shutters, signaling the arrival of a bruised and battered morning. You unbind the leather straps securing the heavy timber, pulling the wood back to reveal a sky the color of beaten lead. The city below is a landscape of wet stone and muddy pools, reflecting the dreary light of the overcast dawn. You lean out slightly, breathing in the complex odor of washed cobblestones, wet ash, and overflowing drainage channels. The Tiber River roars in the distance, a low, continuous thunder that speaks of dangerous currents and swollen banks. The survival of the night feels less like a victory and more like a temporary reprieve from the relentless elements. You pivot back into the room and watch your wife rise from the sleeping pallet, her movements stiff from the cold and the uneven floor. She pulls her linen veil over her hair, tying it securely before moving to assist with the morning fire. The daily routine resumes its iron grip on the household, demanding labor before the body is fully awake. You fetch the clay jug to retrieve fresh water, knowing the neighborhood well will be crowded with others assessing the night's damage. The heavy oak door protests as you pull it open, the hinges swollen with moisture from the relentless rain. You step out onto the dark landing, the chill of the stone stairs seeping instantly through the thin soles of your turn shoes. The alleyway is choked with debris washed down from the higher elevations of the city, a tangle of broken branches, shattered roof tiles, and unidentifiable refuse. You pick your way carefully through the mess, avoiding the deep puddles of dark, stagnant water that have collected in the sunken paving stones. A stray cat sits atop a wooden barrel, grooming its soaked fur with frantic, meticulous strokes. You nod to a baker's apprentice hurrying past with the covered basket, his face pinched shut against the biting wind. The familiar landmarks of your commute are altered by the storm, coated in a layer of slick brown mud that makes every step treacherous. You focus on the physical act of walking, letting muscle memory guide you through the precarious terrain. You arrive at the small piazza housing the communal well, finding a knot of shivering residents already gathered around the stone basin. The conversation is muted and practical, a rapid exchange of damage reports and neighborhood gossip spoken in the coarse local dialect. You learn that a section of a noble family's defensive wall collapsed near the ruined forums, crushing a cart but sparing the driver. You wait your turn patiently, observing the tired faces of the men and women who share this brutal, unyielding existence. The water drawn from the well is murky today, churned up by the heavy rainfall infiltrating the shallow water table. You fill your jug to the brim, the fired clay heavy and cold against your hip as you begin the slow walk back to your dwelling. Returning to the household, you find the fire burning strong and the children sitting close to the hearth, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. You set the water jug down and take your place at the rough wooden table, waiting for the morning ration of bread. The loaf is harder today, the damp air turning the crust into a formidable barrier that requires serious effort to break. You chew the dense rye slowly, letting the saliva soften the grain before swallowing the meager sustenance. There is no watered wine this morning, only the cold, murky well water to wash down the coarse food. The meal is a calculated transaction of calories, an uncelebrated necessity that fuels the demanding hours ahead. You leave the warmth of the hearth and descend to the ground floor, anxious to inspect your workshop for signs of water intrusion. The heavy wooden door is swollen tight within its frame, requiring a hard shove with your shoulder to force it open. You step into the dim, familiar space, your eyes scanning the dirt floor and the timber walls for any lingering moisture. A small puddle has formed near the front entrance, but the majority of your tools and materials remain dry and secure. You exhale a long breath, the tension leaving your shoulders as you realize your livelihood has survived the autumn gale intact. You grab a rough broom and sweep the water out into the street, preparing the space for the day's labor. The hides resting on the wooden rack feel stiff and unyielding, the sudden drop in temperature counteracting the conditioning fat you applied the previous day. You know that working the material in this state will be difficult, requiring more physical force and risking uneven cuts. You set up a small iron brazier near the workbench, transferring a few glowing coals from the upstairs hearth to generate localized heat. The air in the shop slowly warms, the pungent smell of the tanning agents rising as the dampness burns away. You arrange your tools with practiced precision, the iron awls and curved blades cold against your fingers. You pull the first hide onto the bench, bracing your body for the physical exertion required to conquer the stubborn leather. You push the heavy iron stamp into the surface of the leather, your muscles straining against the cold, stiffened material. The mallet falls with a dull, heavy thud, producing a shallower impression than you desire. You adjust your grip and strike again, doubling the force to achieve the necessary depth for the geometric pattern. The work is slow and punishing, a battle of endurance between your aging joints and the unforgiving hide. You focus your attention on the tiny space between the tool and the leather, blocking out the chill of the room and the ache in your back. The rhythm of the strikes becomes a meditation, a steady drumbeat that marks the passage of the early morning hours. Outside the workshop, the city begins to drag itself back to life, a bruised entity assessing its wounds in the pale daylight. You hear the slosh of boots passing through the mud, accompanied by the creak of wooden cart wheels struggling for traction. A group of laborers argues loudly over the clearing of a blocked drainage channel, their voices harsh and demanding. You do not look up from your bench, maintaining your focus on the precise alignment of the next stamped impression. The external world is a distraction you cannot afford, a chaotic current that will sweep you away if you lose your footing. You maintain your grip on the mallet, a simple craftsman holding the line against the encroaching disarray of the ruined capital. The morning light strengthens slightly, casting a cold blue tint over the tools scattered across your scarred workbench. You trace the completed line of geometric shapes with your thumb, feeling the sharp edges of the impressed design. The quality is acceptable, a testament to your stubborn refusal to let the harsh conditions compromise your craft. You reach for a small pot of dark dye, uncorking the clay vessel and dipping a stiff bristled brush into the liquid. You apply the pigment to the freshly stamped leather, watching the dark colors seep into the cuts and highlight the intricate pattern. The smell of the dye is sharp and chemical, a harsh intrusion into the earthy sense of wet wood and cold ash. You hear the familiar, heavy tread of the tanner approaching your open doorway, his boots splashing carelessly through the puddles in the alley. He stops at the threshold, blocking the weak morning light with his massive, broad-shouldered frame. You glance up, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the fresh layer of mud coating the hem of his woolen tunic. He tells you the river has breached the lower embankments, flooding the tanning pits and ruining a week's worth of valuable hides. The news is delivered without emotion, a flat recitation of disaster that is far too common in this unstable environment. You offer a sympathetic nod, knowing the loss will drive up the price of raw materials for months to come. The tanner lingers for a moment, seeking the quiet camaraderie of a fellow craftsman before returning to the devastation of his pits. You share a small piece of stale bread with him, a meager gesture of solidarity that carries significant weight in this hungry city. He chews the crust slowly, his eyes scanning the organized chaos of your workshop with quiet respect. You discuss the shifting currents of the Tiber and the precarious state of the floating mills, acknowledging the fragility of the infrastructure that keeps you all alive. He finally swallows the last bite, wipes his mouth with a stained hand, and turns back out into the cold, muddy street. You are left alone again, the silence of the shop feeling slightly heavier after his departure. You set the dyed leather aside to dry, pulling a fresh, untreated hide onto the bench to begin a new project. This piece is intended for a set of durable harness straps, requiring thick, heavy cuts that will test the sharpness of your best knives. You run a whetstone along the edge of your curved blade, the scraping sound harsh and metallic in the quiet room. You test the edge against your thumb, feeling the microscopic bite of the steel before making the first long, drawing cut across the hide. The leather separates with a satisfying hiss, the tension releasing as the material falls away into two distinct halves. You settle back into the groove of the work, the repetitive actions soothing your restless, storm-weary mind. The hour of tierce rings out from a nearby bell tower, the bronze notes muffled by the heavy, moisture-laden air. The sound reminds you that the morning is advancing, bringing with it the expectation of continued productivity. You flex your stiff fingers, feeling the familiar ache of arthritis settling into the knuckles of your right hand. The pain is an old friend, a constant companion that reminds you of your own mortality and the inevitable decline of your physical strength. You ignore the discomfort, gripping the leather firmly and continuing the precise, demanding work of shaping the raw material. The survival of your family depends solely on your ability to produce, a heavy burden that leaves no room for physical weakness. You notice a shift in the ambient noise outside, the chaotic sounds of the street coalescing into a unified, focused murmur. You step away from the bench and walk to the doorway, peering out into the alley to see a crowd moving purposefully toward the river. Curiosity overcomes your natural caution, prompting you to follow the throng and witness whatever spectacle has drawn their attention. You join the rear of the procession, matching your pace to the hurried steps of your neighbors as they navigate the slippery cobblestones. The smell of the river grows stronger with every block, a thick, muddy odor that speaks of churning sediment and displaced earth. You reach the stone embankment near the Ponce Elias, joining a large group of citizens staring down at the raging Tiber. The water level is terrifyingly high, swirling just inches below the tops of the ancient retaining walls. The river is a savage, opaque brown, carrying massive tree trunks and the shattered remnants of ruined buildings in its swift current. You watch a heavy wooden cart bobbing in the center of the flow, spinning out of control before being smashed against the stone pier of the bridge. The crowd gasps collectively, a sharp intake of breath that underscores the raw, destructive power of the flooded waterway. You pull your cloak tighter, shivering as the cold mist from the churning river coats your face and clothing. The floating mills are in grave danger, straining against their heavy mooring ropes as the floodwaters threaten to tear them loose. The millers are frantic, scrambling across the wet wooden decks with axes in hand, ready to cut the lines if the structures begin to capsize. You watch a massive oak trunk careen down the center of the channel, aiming directly for a cluster of anchored mills near the far bank. The impact is brutal, a deafening splintering of wood that sends one of the water wheels crashing into the foaming current. The crowd groans in sympathetic horror, knowing that the loss of a mill means less flour, higher prices, and inevitable hunger in the coming weeks. The river demands its toll, taking what it wants with terrifying indifference. You step back from the destruction, unable to watch the desperate struggles of the men fighting to save their livelihoods. The reality of Rome is stark and unforgiving, a constant balancing act on the edge of a blade that can slip at any moment. You push your way back through the gathered onlookers, eager to return to the predictable, manageable confines of your own workshop. The walk back feels longer, the mud clinging to your thin shoes and adding heavy weight to every step. You pass the ruined temples and the fortified towers, seeing them not as monuments to a glorious past, but as temporary shelters in a hostile, decaying world. You realize that endurance is the only true virtue in this city, the stubborn refusal to surrender to the overwhelming forces arrayed against you. You re-enter the dim sanctuary of your shop, the familiar smells of leather and wax offering a profound sense of comfort. You sit back down at the scarred wooden bench, picking up the half-finished harness strap and the sharp, curved knife. You resume your work with renewed focus, the methodical cutting and shaping serving as an antidote to the chaos you just witnessed at the river. The leather is tough and resilient, yielding only to deliberate, skilled application of force. You pour your anxiety and fear into the physical labor, transforming raw emotion into tangible, useful goods. The day stretches ahead, a long expanse of hours that must be filled with sweat, precision, and the relentless drive to survive another brutal Roman autumn. You press the edge of the curved knife against the thick ox hide. The weight of your shoulder drives the steel through the stubborn material. The leather parts with a stiff, reluctant hiss, leaving behind a clean edge that will soon become part of a heavy draft harness. The physical effort sends a dull throb radiating up your forearm. It is a familiar reminder of the toll this trade extracts from your joints. You adjust your grip on the wooden handle, ensuring the sweat from your palm does not compromise the dangerous precision of the blade. The chaotic events of the morning fade into a muted background hum. The craft demands your focus. You exhale slowly. You blow a speck of dust from the cutting line before bearing down for the next arduous slice. Steam rises in thin, ghostly wisps from the damp cobblestones outside your door. The midday sun finally pierces the heavy cloud cover. The sudden warmth strikes the soaked city with an oppressive humidity, transforming the narrow alleyway into a sweltering corridor of stagnant air. The smells of the neighborhood intensify under the solar assault. Wet ash mixes with the sour odor of the nearby street gutters. Flies begin to emerge from the hidden crevices of the brickwork. Their frantic buzzing adds a restless energy to the heavy atmosphere. A sudden sliver of harsh light cuts across your workbench, illuminating the microscopic floating particles of dried leather and crushed chalk. You lift the separated strip of hide and inspect the newly exposed cross-section. You search for any hidden flaws or weak fibrous tissue. The material is dense and uniform. It is a premium cut that justifies the strenuous effort required to shape it properly. You toss the heavy strap onto a growing pile near the back wall, satisfied that the raw components are ready for the laborious punching and stitching phase. The sheer volume of manual labor required to complete a single harness is staggering, yet it remains the only viable method for turning a profit in this fractured economy. You reach for a piece of rough pumice stone. You run it along the freshly cut edges to smooth away the microscopic burrs left by the iron blade. The abrasive friction generates a faint smell of singed hair and tanned protein. You secure the completed belts and a finely tooled scabbard, wrapping them securely in a length of coarse woolen cloth to protect them from the mud. Delivering these goods requires you to leave the relative safety of your neighborhood and cross into the contested territory near the Quirinal Hill. You strap the heavy package across your back. The rough fabric bites into the linen shirt covering your shoulder blades. The walk takes you away from the river and up toward the higher elevations. It is a grueling climb through streets that still bear the catastrophic scars of ancient sieges and medieval neglect. A hollow pang in your stomach reminds you of the meager morning ration. Hard bread has long since been burned away by the physical demands of the forge and the bench. You navigate the treacherous, mud-slicked thoroughfares with cautious grace. You are a lifelong resident accustomed to the hazards of the crumbling infrastructure. The floodwaters from the Tiber have receded slightly. They leave behind a thick coating of brown silt that coats the lower half of every building and monument. You step carefully over a shattered terracotta amphora, its jagged edges jutting out from the muck like the teeth of a buried predator. The air here smells strongly of wet decay and the distinct sulfurous odor of a nearby lime kiln burning marble into mortar. You keep your head down, avoiding eye contact with the armed retainers lounging outside a fortified tower belonging to the powerful Frangipani clan. You are merely a craftsman. Anonymity is your greatest defense against the arbitrary violence of the nobility. Shadows cling stubbornly to the recessed arches of the ruined baths of Constantine. The apex of the day bleeds into the early afternoon. The massive brick vaults loom overhead like hollow mountains, their original purpose forgotten by the ragged squatters who now occupy the cavernous interior. Thin columns of wood smoke drift from the makeshift shelters erected within the ancient structure. It is evidence of the desperate poverty that exists just blocks away from the papal palaces. A flock of feral pigeons erupts from a shattered clerestory window. Their wings clap loudly against the stagnant air before they vanish over the rooftops. The sheer scale of the imperial architecture diminishes the medieval inhabitants. It reduces their chaotic struggles to temporary insignificances against the backdrop of eternal stone. You arrive at the heavy iron-studded doors of your wealthy client's domus. Your legs burn from the steep ascent and the heavy burden on your back. The entrance is flanked by two imposing granite columns, salvaged from a forgotten temple and repurposed to project an aura of unassailable authority. You lift the heavy bronze knocker and let it fall against the striker plate. The sharp metallic crack echoes down the deserted side street. A small viewing grate slides open with a raspy screech, revealing the suspicious eyes of a household guard assessing your threat level. You state your business in a flat, respectful tone. You shift the weight of the woolen bundle to prove your identity as a contracted vendor. The grate slams shut. Heavy iron bars clank back from the thick timber portals. Inside, the courtyard is an oasis of startling tranquility. It is isolated from the noise and filth of the Roman streets by thick, unyielding walls. A small fountain bubbles in the center of the mosaic floor. The clean water catches the slanting sunlight and throws dancing reflections against the plastered arcades. The smell of the street is immediately replaced by the scent of imported incense and roasting meats. It is a tantalizing aroma that makes your empty stomach twist with sharp desire. You stand awkwardly on the edge of the polished marble, acutely aware of the mud caking your thin shoes and the sweat staining your coarse tunic. A steward dressed in dyed green wool approaches with a ledger in his hands. His expression is a practiced mask of bureaucratic indifference. You hand the wrapped package to the steward. You watch carefully as he unrolls the rough cloth to inspect the commissioned leatherwork. His long, uncalloused fingers trace the geometric stamping on the scabbard, searching for any flaw or deviation that might justify a reduction in your agreed-upon payment. You hold your breath. An arbitrary rejection would mean a week of lost wages and subsequent hunger for your extended family. The steward grunts a minimal acknowledgement of the quality. He pulls a small leather purse from his belt to count out the silver denarii. You accept the coins with a deferential nod, biting the metal out of hard-won habit to verify their authenticity before securing them in your own pouch. You turn and exit the silent courtyard. You are eager to return to the chaotic, familiar dirt of your own neighborhood. Harsh winds sweep across the exposed elevation of the Quirinal. It carries the distinct chill that promises a bitter, freezing dusk. The afternoon advances steadily, the brief respite of the midday sun giving way to the inevitable cooling of the autumn atmosphere. You pull your cappuccio up over your head, letting the thick wool shield your neck from the biting draft as you begin the descent back toward the river. The silver coins in your pouch represent a temporary victory. They are a localized triumph over the grinding mechanics of poverty that rule the lives of the artisan class. You plan to stop at the Campo Vaccino on the way home, hoping to purchase a small cut of mutton to fortify the evening stew. The prospect of meat provides a surge of renewed energy. Your pace quickens as you navigate the steep, treacherous switchbacks of the ancient streets. You walk into the sprawling expanse of the old Roman Forum. The area is now universally known as the cow pasture, due to the massive herds grazing among the ruins. The ground is a treacherous mix of mud, loose cobblestones, and fresh animal droppings. It demands constant vigilance to avoid slipping. The lowing of hundreds of cattle creates a deafening, continuous drone that reverberates off the half-buried triumphal arches and the shattered columns of the Temple of Saturn. A group of rough-looking herdsmen from the Campagna lean on their long wooden staffs. Their faces are weathered to the texture of old leather by a lifetime of outdoor exposure. You give them a wide berth. You respect their volatile nature and the sharp knives they carry openly on their belts. Hunger gnaws relentlessly at your ribs as you approach the temporary wooden stalls erected near the edge of the grazing grounds. The butchers operate in the open air. Their heavy cleavers rise and fall with sickening crunches as they process the slaughtered livestock. The stench of fresh blood, offal, and raw meat is overpowering. It attracts thick swarms of flies that coat the hanging carcasses in a shifting, iridescent layer. You negotiate with a burly vendor whose apron is stiff with gore, pointing to a modest cut of mutton that fits the limitations of your newly acquired silver. The haggling is brief and aggressive. It is a necessary ritual that ends with the meat wrapped in a large cabbage leaf and tucked safely into your satchel. You purchase a handful of hard root vegetables from a neighboring stall. You add the dense, soil-crusted carrots and turnips to your heavy load. The market begins to thin out as the afternoon shadows stretch across the uneven ground, signaling the approach of the evening hours. A pair of stray dogs fights viciously over a discarded bone near the butcher's block. Their snarls mix with the general cacophony of the declining day. You secure your satchel and turn toward the narrow alleys that lead back to your workshop. The physical weight of the food offers immense psychological comfort. You have secured sustenance for another day. It is a fundamental achievement that overrides all other concerns in this precarious existence. Returning to the damp familiarity of your own street, the noise of the cattle market fades. The localized sounds of the artisanal district take over. The blacksmith is still hammering away at his forge, the red glow of the heated iron visible through the gloom of his open doorway. You push open the heavy timber door of your own shop. The smell of wax and tanning liquor welcomes you back to the center of your universe. The cold has settled back into the room, reclaiming the space left vulnerable by the dying embers in your small brazier. You set your satchel down on the bench. The physical relief of unburdening your shoulders makes you sigh heavily in the quiet room. You settle onto your wooden stool and retrieve the half-finished harness strap. You abandoned it earlier in the day. The leather is stiff and uncooperative once more, requiring you to fetch the pumice stone and the rendering fat to resume the grueling process. You look at the small pile of silver coins resting on the corner of the bench. It is a tangible representation of your physical sacrifice and technical skill. The light from the single window is fading rapidly. The golden hues of the late afternoon give way to the bruised purple of the approaching dusk. You grip the iron awl and press it into the hide. Your hands move with an automated rhythm that will carry you safely into the dark. You drive the iron awl through the thick harness leather, twisting your wrist to widen the puncture. The resistance of the damp hide sends a sharp ache up your forearm, a familiar reminder of the physical cost of your trade. You pull the waxed linen thread taut, locking the heavy brass buckle firmly into place against the reinforced strap. The light inside the workshop is failing rapidly, casting long, distorted shadows that obscure the finer details of your craftsmanship. You test the strength of the scene by pulling hard against the metal fitting, satisfied when the stitches hold without yielding. The final piece of the heavy draft collar is complete, ready to endure the punishing labor of the roaming campagna. Outside, the frantic energy of the artisanal district begins to wane as the sun dips below the ruined skyline. Hammers strike anvils with less frequency, the sharp ringing replaced by the dull thud of heavy wooden shutters being slammed shut. Smoke from 100 dying forges drifts through the narrow alleyway, carrying the bitter scent of scorched iron and cooling charcoal. A pair of stray dogs scuffles over a discarded bone near the street corner, their brief snarls echoing loudly in the damp air. The chill of the impending evening creeps over the cobblestones, forcing the remaining merchants to pack their wares with hurried, shivering motions. You gather the scattered tools from your scarred workbench, organizing the blades and punches into their designated leather rolls. You wipe the residual rendered fat from your hands, using a piece of rough scrap cloth, though the embedded stains remain untouched. The wooden chest at the back of the shop receives the finished harness and the leftover raw materials, locking away the value of your labor. You sweep the dirt floor with a stiff bristled broom, pushing the accumulated shavings and dust out over the threshold. The physical act of cleaning signals the definitive end of the workday, creating a mental boundary between the demands of the craft and the needs of your household. You secure the heavy timber door with a thick iron bar, the metal scraping loudly against the stone brackets. You turn toward the narrow internal staircase that leads up to the living quarters, your legs heavy from the long miles walked earlier today. The satchel slung across your shoulder bumps against the plaster wall, the weight of the mutton and root vegetables offering a comforting presence. You climb the creaking wooden steps one at a time, the smell of wood smoke and damp wool greeting you from the floor above. The transition from the solitary focus of the workshop to the communal space of your family happens within the span of a dozen stairs. Firelight flickers unevenly across the low ceiling of the main room, casting a warm orange glow that pushes back the gathering gloom. Two small children sit near the stone hearth, their faces illuminated as they watch their mother coax the embers with a wooden bellows. The air is thick with the scent of burning oak and the residual odor of wet clothing drying near the heat. A worn iron pot hangs suspended over the nascent flames, waiting for the ingredients that will form the evening meal. The entire space feels intimate and intensely crowded, a localized sanctuary suspended above the ruined, hostile expanse of the medieval city. You drop the heavy satchel onto the rough wooden table, the thud immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. You untie the leather cords and peel back the large cabbage leaf to reveal the dark, raw cut of mutton purchased at the Campo Vaccino. The children abandon their spot by the fire, crowding around the table with wide eyes to inspect the rare luxury of fresh meat. You hand the butchered flesh to your wife, watching her face soften with a mixture of relief and practical calculation. She immediately sets to work with a small sharp knife, slicing the tough muscle into smaller, manageable pieces to ensure it cooks thoroughly in the stew. You pull the hard, soil-crusted root vegetables from the bottom of the bag, dumping the carrots and turnips onto the scarred wood. You grab a dull blade and begin scraping the dirt from the uneven surfaces, the grit grating unpleasantly against the steel edge. The fibrous roots are dense and unyielding, requiring significant pressure to chop into rough chunks suitable for the iron cauldron. You toss the prepared vegetables into a wooden bowl, the hollow clatter adding to the domestic symphony of the busy household. The anticipation of a substantial, caloric meal changes the atmosphere in the room, replacing the usual weary resignation with a subtle, underlying excitement. Fat begins to sizzle and pop inside the heated iron pot, releasing a rich, savory aroma that instantly triggers a painful cramp of hunger. Smoke billows up toward the blackened rafters, stinging the eyes and coating the back of the throat with a harsh, woody taste. The chopped mutton browns quickly against the hot metal, the meat rendering its valuable grease into the base of the broth. Handfuls of coarse salt and a pinch of dried herbs are thrown into the mixture, elevating the crude ingredients with localized flavors. The heavy stew requires constant stirring with a long wooden spoon to prevent the bottom layer from scorching against the intense, concentrated heat. You walk over to the single-shuttered window and pull the wooden slat back a fraction of an inch to peer outside. You look down into the rapidly darkening alley, observing the final moments of twilight surrendering to the encroaching Roman night. The fortified tower of the Frangipani clan looms in the distance, a black, jagged silhouette against the bruised purple canvas of the sky. You watch a solitary figure hurrying down the street with a burning torch, casting frantic, elongated shadows across the wet brickwork. You release the latch and let the shutter snap closed, sealing the cold and the danger outside your solid walls. You return to the warmth of the hearth, taking a seat on a low, three-legged stool near the radiating heat. You stretch your legs out toward the fire, feeling the damp chill bake out of your heavy woolen hose. The muscles in your lower back throb with the dull, persistent ache, the cumulative toll of hauling water, hammering leather, and climbing the Quernal Hill. You close your eyes for just a moment, letting the rhythmic bubbling of the stew soothe your fractured nerves. The physical demands of the era require an immense capacity for endurance, forcing you to steal these fleeting seconds of recovery whenever they appear. Supper is finally served in shallow wooden bowls, the thick broth ladled generously over chunks of stale dark rye bread. Steam rises from the hot food, carrying the intoxicating smell of rendered fat, boiled root vegetables, and salted meat. The family eats with frantic, focused energy, the wooden spoons scraping loudly against the bottom of the rough containers. Conversation is wholly absent, replaced by the primal necessity of replacing the calories burned during the grueling day. The mutton is tough and requires serious chewing, but the rich flavor is a massive improvement over the usual fare of watery beans and millet. You wipe the last drops of grease from your bowl with a final crust of bread, savoring the salty residue on your tongue. You feel the immediate heavy lethargy that follows a substantial meal, your body redirecting its limited energy toward digestion. You set the empty dish onto the table, leaning back against the rough plaster wall with a profound sense of temporary satisfaction. The wind picks up outside, howling down the narrow street and rattling the timber shutters with renewed malice. You listen to the elements battering the ancient masonry, perfectly content to remain trapped within the smoky, crowded warmth of your humble domain. You watch your cousin begin the tedious process of washing the wooden bowls in a small clay basin near the door. You reach for a piece of scrap leather and your bone needle, intending to repair a torn seam on your heavy winter tunic. The ambient light from the fire is poor, forcing you to lean close to the flames to see the stitches clearly. You push the needle to the coarse wool, your fingers moving with the blind, automated precision of lifelong habit. The domestic tasks never truly end, blending seamlessly into the evening hours until the darkness demands an absolute halt to all productive activity. Voices drift up from the ground level of the adjacent building, a muffled argument over spilled ale and miscounted coins. The walls of these medieval tenements are porous, allowing the sounds and smells of your neighbors to intrude upon your isolated sanctuary. A sudden crash of pottery echoes through the brickwork, followed by a sharp string of curses spoken in the rough street dialect. The proximity of so many desperate, struggling souls creates a perpetual tension that never fully dissipates, even in the dead of night. The community is bound together by geography and poverty, a volatile mixture that frequently ignites into localized, contained violence. You ignore the disturbance next door, pulling the heavy thread tight to close the gap in your woolen garment. You bite the end of the line, severing the cord with your teeth before tying a secure knot against the fabric. You inspect the repair, running your thumb over the bumpy seam to ensure the cold wind will not penetrate the patch. You fold the tunic carefully and set it aside, your hands finally empty and resting loosely on your lap. The Vesper bells rang hours ago, and the deep total obscurity of the Compline hour is rapidly approaching the ruined city. You notice the small pile of wood shavings near the hearth, the remnants of your cousin's whittling from the previous evening. You gather the curled strips of oak into your calloused hands, tossing them directly into the center of the glowing coals. The thin wood catches instantly, flaring up in a bright, brief burst of yellow flame that illuminates the darkest corners of the room. You watch the shadows dance wildly across the uneven ceiling, the shifting light playing tricks on your exhausted eyes. The fire is the central axis of your existence during these cold months, providing heat, light, cooked food, and psychological comfort against the oppressive dark. Across the room, your wife pulls a thick, woolen blanket from the wooden storage chest, shaking out the dust and the smell of dried lavender. She drapes the heavy fabric over the children's sleeping pallet, tucking the edges tightly underneath the straw ticking to create a warm cocoon. The youngsters are already nodding off, their bodies worn out by the chaotic events of the storm and the freezing morning. A resonant cough sounds from the floor below, a stark reminder of the respiratory illnesses that plague the population throughout the damp Roman winters. The air inside the dwelling is permanently compromised by the lack of proper ventilation, a gradual poison accepted in exchange for the immediate necessity of warmth. You stand up from the three-legged stool, stretching your spine until you hear a satisfying, sharp crack between your shoulder blades. You walk over to the clay water jug, uncorking the vessel to pour a small amount of the murky liquid into a wooden cup. You drink the cold water deliberately, washing away the lingering taste of the salty mutton broth and the harsh wood smoke. You set the cup down and move to check the iron bolt on the main door, rattling the heavy hardware to ensure it is seated firmly in the stone brackets. You take no chances with the security of your household, knowing that the desperate elements of the city grow bolder as the night deepens. You settle back onto the wooden bench, crossing your arms over your chest and staring into the shifting orange architecture of the coals. Your mind wanders back to the ruined floating mills on the flooded Tiber, calculating the probable increase in the cost of milled flour. You mentally adjust your household budget to absorb the impending shock, realizing your leather goods will need to be priced higher to compensate. This is a dangerous game of economic brinkmanship played with your increasingly impoverished clients across the crumbling metropolis. You massage your temples with your fingertips, attempting to push the relentless financial anxiety out of your weary thoughts. A distant bell begins to toll from the direction of the Lateran Palace, the mournful sound carrying easily over the hushed city. It is the final warning of the night, the signal that the municipal watch will now strictly enforce the harsh curfew laws. Anyone caught wandering the treacherous, unlit alleys will be subject to brutal interrogation and immediate imprisonment in the dank cells of the noble towers. The acoustic landscape of Rome shifts from the chaotic din of commerce to the eerie, isolated sounds of wind, water, and watchful silence. The sprawling metropolis shrinks down to the size of a single room, fully disconnected from the thousands of other terrified, shivering households locked away in the dark. The absolute obscurity of the Roman night presses heavily against the exterior of the building, a physical weight that seems to test the strength of the mortar. You remain seated on the rough wooden bench, your eyes completely useless in the windowless room now that the single candle has died. The residual heat from the hearth offers the only geographical anchor in the pitch-black space, radiating a muted warmth against your shins. Outside the heavy timber shutters, the wind courses through the narrow alleyway, carrying the distinct, metallic scent of the swollen river. The city has surrendered entirely to the elements in the shadows, stripping away the bustling illusions of the daytime market. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the ceiling joists is magnified by the profound isolation of the curfew hours. You stand up with deliberate care, mapping the unseen obstacles of the cramped living quarters through years of intimate familiarity. Your thin leather turn shoes glide silently over the packed dirt and uneven boards, navigating the narrow path between the wooden table and the sleeping pallet. You reach down and brush your fingertips against the coarse wool blanket covering your family, feeling the steady rise and fall of their collective breathing. The fabric is rough and scratchy, woven from the cheapest local fleece, yet it serves as the ultimate barrier against the biting autumn draft. You adjust the edge of the heavy textile, tucking it firmly under the straw mattress to prevent the cold from seeping into their fragile cocoon. The silent, unconscious rhythm of their rest provides a profound anchor, a reminder of the fundamental purpose driving your endless days of grueling labor. The masonry walls of the dwelling exude a deep, penetrating chill that battles constantly with the localized heat of the small fire. This building is a patchwork of necessity, constructed from scavenged bricks and chunks of travertine liberated from the decaying imperial monuments surrounding the neighborhood. The ancient mortar, mixed centuries before your birth, still holds the uneven stones together with an obstinate grip that defies the relentless Roman damp. You trace the rough surface of the nearest wall with your palm, feeling the deep grooves and chipped edges of the repurposed materials. The history of the empire is literally embedded in the structure of your home, reducing the grand architectural ambitions of the past to the utilitarian survival of the present. The stones offer no comfort, only the stark reality of shelter against an indifferent sky. You step away from the wall and move back toward the hearth, deciding that the dropping temperature requires a minor sacrifice of your hoarded fuel. You kneel on the hearthstone and blindly select a small, seasoned branch from the kindling pile, testing its dryness by the texture of the bark. You push the wood into the center of the glowing coals, blowing a steady stream of air over the ash until a tiny, flickering flame emerges. The sudden burst of weak orange light forces you to squint, your pupils contracting painfully after adjusting to the total blackness. The flame illuminates the soot-stained bricks of the firebox and casts long, frantic shadows across the ceiling, briefly revealing the hanging bundles of dried herbs. The sharp scent of burning oak cuts through the stale air, a fragrant luxury that you can only afford to indulge for a few minutes. You pull your heavy woolen cloak tighter across your shoulders, shivering as a sudden draft snakes across the floorboards and bites at your ankles. The dampness from the recent flood has saturated the lower levels of the city, creeping up through the porous stone and infecting the air with a cloying humidity. You rub your calloused hands together over the small fire, feeling the abrasive friction of the thick skin and the deep permanent stains of the tanning dye. The joints in your fingers throb with a persistent gnawing ache, the inevitable consequence of gripping tight iron tools and pulling heavy linen thread. You massage the base of your thumb, attempting to work the stiffness out of the muscle before the cold can permanently lock the tendons. The physical maintenance of your own body is a critical daily task, an absolute requirement for ensuring tomorrow's productivity. Down in the street below, the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots signals the passage of the municipal night watch on their regular patrol. The clatter of their iron-tipped spears striking the cobblestones echoes sharply against the brick facades, a harsh, metallic sound that cuts through the wind. You hold your breath instinctively, standing perfectly still until the menacing noise gradually fades into the labyrinth of the adjacent district. The guards represent the brutal, unpredictable authority of the senatorial factions, enforcing the curfew with a casual violence that spares no one. Their presence is theoretically meant to deter thieves, but their heavy-handed tactics often make them as dangerous as the criminals they are supposed to hunt. The silence that follows their departure feels thicker and more oppressive, leaving you alone again with the creaking timbers of your ancient tenement. You turn your attention to the small wooden chest resting in the corner, the repository for your most valuable and delicate iron implements. You lift the heavy lid, the leather hinges protesting with a subdued squeak that seems abnormally loud in the hushed room. You reach inside and withdraw a curved half-moon knife, the primary tool used for skiving and thinning the thick ox hides down in your workshop. You run the pad of your thumb lightly across the curved steel, assessing the microscopic integrity of the edge by touch alone. The metal is freezing, pulling the heat directly from your skin and confirming the pervasive drop in the atmospheric temperature. Maintaining the lethal sharpness of this blade is essential, dictating the speed and precision of your entire artisanal output. You retrieve a small, smooth whetstone from the bottom of the chest, preparing to hone the steel while the rest of the household slumbers. You spit lightly onto the abrasive surface, providing a meager lubrication before laying the flat edge of the knife against the stone. You push the blade forward in a smooth, sweeping arc, producing a gritty, metallic rasp that you attempt to muffle by covering the tool with a rag. The friction generates a faint, localized warmth, a microscopic exchange of energy that slowly refines the cutting edge of the expensive iron. You repeat the motion with mechanical consistency, counting the strokes in your head to ensure the bevel remains perfectly even across the curve. The monotonous task requires complete focus, banishing the persistent anxieties regarding the flooded river and the rising cost of milled grain. The oppressive reality of the Roman food supply weighs heavily on the minds of every commoner trapped within the Aurelian walls. The floating mills damaged during the morning deluge will severely throttle the production of flour, sending the price of basic rye and millet soaring beyond the reach of casual laborers. You calculate the remaining provisions stored in the clay jars near the door, dividing the pounds of hard grain by the daily caloric requirements of your dependents. The math is brutal and unforgiving, offering no margin for error or sudden, unexpected expenses like illness or injury. You know that you will have to increase your output, taking on more commissions from the wealthy estates on the Quirinal to bridge the impending financial gap. The economic survival of the family is a complex, terrifying puzzle that you must solve continuously, week after brutal week. You finish honing the half-moon knife, wiping the dark slurry of oil and steel dust from the blade with a scrap of soiled linen. You test the edge again, satisfied when the metal catches the top layer of your calloused skin with a sharp, eager bite. You place the tool back into the wooden chest, wrapping it securely in a piece of oiled leather to protect it from the corrosive, salty dampness of the air. You close the heavy lid and secure the iron clasp, locking away the implements that define your status and guarantee your continued existence. The brief burst of activity has warmed your blood slightly, pushing back the encroaching lethargy of the deep night hours. You stand up and stretch your arms toward the low ceiling, feeling the vertebrae in your spine pop in a satisfying sequential chain. You cross the room to inspect the wooden bucket placed under the leaking roof earlier, checking the water level by dipping a finger into the dark liquid. The rain has stopped entirely, leaving the container only half full of murky, debris-filled runoff that smells strongly of decaying thatch and pigeon droppings. You leave the bucket in place, knowing the saturated roof will continue to weep moisture into the dwelling for the next several days. The constant battle against the elements is exhausting, a never-ending cycle of patching, catching, and repairing the structural failures of the aging tenement. You wipe your wet finger on your tunic, the rough wool absorbing the moisture instantly without offering any real sensation of cleanliness. The grime of the city is inescapable, a permanent layer of dust and soot that coats everything within the urban boundary. A sudden, frantic scuttling sound erupts from the darkness behind the heavy grain sacks, followed by the high-pitched squeak of a territorial dispute. The vermin of Rome are as numerous and resilient as the human population, infesting the ancient ruins and the medieval tenements with equal enthusiasm. You grab a heavy piece of firewood and strike it against the floorboards, the loud thud temporarily silencing the unseen scavengers. The mice are a constant threat to your limited food supply, requiring you to store the edible provisions in heavy clay amphorae sealed with wax. You listen intently to ensure the creatures have retreated, the defense of your larder ranking just below the defense of your physical safety. The city is a shared ecosystem, a hostile environment where every species competes fiercely for the meager resources left behind by the vanished empire. You return to the hearth, finding the small branch has burned down to a fragile skeleton of white ash, plunging the room back into near total darkness. The brief respite of light is over, leaving you entirely dependent on the remaining heat radiating from the thick stone hearth. You sit back down on the three-legged stool, pulling your knees up to your chest and wrapping your arms around your shins to conserve your core temperature. The night stretches out before you, an unmeasured expanse of time devoid of clocks, bells, or any external markers of progression. You must rely on the internal rhythms of your own body, reading the depth of your fatigue and the biting edge of the cold to guess the approaching dawn. The isolation is profound, severing you from the community and leaving you alone with the relentless machinery of your own thoughts. You let your mind wander back to the colossal, ruined amphitheater you passed on your journey to the wealthy estate earlier today. The massive stone arches of the Colosseum loomed against the gray sky, a baffling, incomprehensible monument to a civilization whose purpose has been entirely forgotten. The local legends claim it was a temple of demonic worship, a pagan stronghold destroyed by divine wrath and left to rot as a warning to the faithful. You do not question this narrative, accepting the supernatural explanation for the sheer, terrifying scale of the ancient engineering. The shadows within those broken corridors seem to harbor ancient, malicious forces, making the ruin a place to be avoided whenever possible. The physical presence of the past is overwhelming, a constant, silent judgment upon the squalor and diminished capacity of the present era. You shift your weight on the hard wooden stool, attempting to relieve the pressure on your aching tailbone. The silence of the room is broken only by the synchronized, rhythmic breathing of your wife and children, a fragile auditory tether connecting you to the realm of the living. You focus on that sound, matching your own shallow inhalations to their steady pace, drawing comfort from the simple fact of their continued survival. The night watch is a lonely, grueling necessity, a sacrifice of rest required to protect the vulnerable borders of the household from fire, water, and human malice. You endure the cold and the dark with the stoic resignation of a man who understands that suffering is the default condition of the world. You close your eyes, not to rest, but to heighten your remaining senses, transforming yourself into a silent, vigilant sentinel against the encroaching threats of the Roman night. The dampness of the Roman winter seems to seep directly into the marrow of your bones, ignoring the barrier of the heavy woolen cloak. You picture the sprawling, desolate expanse of the Campagna beyond the city walls, the empty fields dominated by broken aqueducts and roaming herds of semi-wild cattle. The herders who manage those beasts are currently sleeping under the open sky, their rough cloaks offering the only shelter against the biting frost. You feel a sudden, intense gratitude for the crumbling walls of your tenement, recognizing the vast difference between urban poverty and the raw, unprotected savagery of the wilderness. The city, for all its filth, violence, and decay, represents the ultimate sanctuary against the indifferent brutality of the natural world. You tighten your grip on the edges of your cloak, drawing the heavy fabric closer around your neck. You hear the distant, muffled sound of the Tiber River crashing against the stone piers of the Pons Aelius, a relentless, churning roar that defies the stillness of the night. The water is a primal force, an untamed artery cutting through the heart of the civilized ruins, bringing both life-giving commerce and sudden, devastating ruin. You remember the sight of the heavy wooden cart being smashed into kindling by the floodwaters earlier today, a visceral demonstration of the river's absolute lack of mercy. The geography of Rome dictates the terms of your survival, forcing you to navigate its hazards with the cautious respect demanded by a sleeping predator. You listen to the aquatic thunder, grateful that your dwelling sits on a slight elevation, safely above the reach of the muddy, swirling current. You reach into the leather pouch tied to your belt, your fingers finding the small, hard shapes of the silver denarii you earned from the wealthy steward. You trace the raised profile of the papal insignia stamped into the metal, the rough edge of the coin a reassuring texture in the dark. This small handful of currency represents your only defense against the looming threat of starvation, the physical manifestation of your sweat, skill, and grueling labor. You calculate the exact amount of coarse grain, salted fish, and rendering fat these coins can purchase, planning the next week's diet with meticulous, anxious precision. The economy of survival is a harsh, unforgiving master, demanding constant vigilance and the total suppression of any desire beyond the basic requirements of life. You release the coins and let them fall back into the pouch with a soft, metallic clink. You rub your eyes with the heels of your hands, attempting to banish the gritty, burning sensation caused by the lack of proper sleep and the pervasive wood smoke. The air inside the room is stale and heavy, depleted of oxygen by the lingering heat of the hearth and the respiration of the crowded family. You long for a breath of fresh, cold air, but opening the shutters would invite the freezing draft and risk extinguishing the vital, banked coals. You accept the discomfort as a necessary condition of winter survival, trading the luxury of clean air for the absolute necessity of thermal preservation. The physical compromises demanded by this existence are endless, a continuous negotiation between competing miseries that defines the medieval experience. You lower your hands and stare blindly into the darkness, waiting patiently for the long, slow turn of the earth. You feel the subtle, microscopic shift in the barometric pressure, a heaviness in the air that suggests the storm clouds outside are finally beginning to fracture. The absolute opacity of the room seems to thin just a fraction, the darkest corners losing their solid, impenetrable quality as the night reaches its deepest point. You know that the hour of matins is approaching, the time when the monks in the distant basilicas will rise from their beds to sing the night office. You do not hear their bells yet, but the anticipation of the sound provides a mental anchor, a reminder that the progression of time has not entirely halted. You remain seated on the stool, a silent witness to the slow, agonizing death of the Roman night, ready to face whatever harsh realities the pre-dawn silence will bring. You sit rigid on the low wooden stool, letting the pre-dawn silence wash over your tired frame. The temperature in the cramped room has plummeted to its lowest point, bringing a sharp, unforgiving frost that gnaws at the edges of your woolen cloak. The air is stagnant and heavy with the metallic scent of cold ash and the lingering sour odor of damp wool. You wrap your arms tighter around your torso, trapping the meager heat your body generates against your chest. The darkness remains an unbroken, solid wall that renders your eyes useless, forcing you to navigate the passing minutes entirely through sound and touch. The city outside is holding its breath, caught in that treacherous, suspended hour when the night refuses to die and the sun has yet to arrive. You listen to the erratic, unpredictable gusts of wind tearing through the narrow alleyway below your shuttered window. The gale has lost the furious malice of the earlier storm, reduced now to a hollow, mournful whistling that snakes through the invisible cracks in the brickwork. A loose terracotta tile clatters against a neighboring roof, sliding down the incline before shattering on the cobblestones with a harsh, startling crack. The noise echoes briefly against the stone facades, fading back into the oppressive quiet with an eerie suddenness. You map the structural integrity of your own dwelling by the subtle groans of the timber joists above your head. The ancient wood contracts in the freezing temperature, settling into the masonry with slow, agonizing creaks that sound like the complaining joints of an old man. You shift your weight on the hard seat, trying to relieve the mounting pressure on your aching tailbone. The stiffness in your lower back radiates outward, a dull and persistent throbbing that catalogs the relentless physical labor of the previous day. You press the knuckles of your right hand into your thigh, feeling the dense, unyielding calluses that have formed over decades of gripping iron tools. Your body is an instrument of survival, honed and battered by the constant demands of the leather trade in a city that offers no quarter to the weak. You accept the pain as a necessary condition of your existence, a physical ledger that records the exact cost of keeping your family fed and sheltered. The endurance required to maintain this vigil is vast, demanding a mental fortitude that matches the toughness of the ox hides you shape. You catch a faint rhythmic sound drifting from the direction of the great basilicas across the river. It is the distant, haunting chant of monks singing the office of matins, their voices merging into a single, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the frigid air. The melody is mournful and repetitive, a desperate plea for divine mercy cast out into the unfeeling void of the Roman night. You do not understand the Latin words, but the cadence offers a strange structural comfort, a reminder that the spiritual machinery of the city is still grinding forward. The monks are fighting the darkness with their lungs and their faith, holding the line against the encroaching shadows while the rest of the fractured metropolis hides behind barred doors. You bow your head slightly, letting the muffled ecclesiastical drone wash over your exhausted mind. You focus your attention on the shallow wooden bucket sitting in the corner, placed there hours ago to catch the rainwater weeping through the thatch. The dripping has ceased, replaced by a subtle, crystalline ticking sound as the collected water begins to freeze against the clay rim. The frost is creeping into the room, a silent and insidious invader that coats the rough floorboards in a thin, treacherous glaze of ice. You rub your boots against the packed dirt, feeling the granular crunch of the frozen soil beneath the thin leather soles. The battle against the elements has shifted from a defense against water to a desperate defense against the cold. You know that the morning will require immense effort just to thaw the frozen joints of the household and coax the frozen world back into motion. You think about the workshop situated directly beneath your feet, calculating the impact of the plummeting temperature on your raw materials. The untreated hides resting on the wooden racks will harden into stiff, uncooperative boards, requiring intensive conditioning with animal fat before they can be cut. The pots of dark dye will turn sluggish and thick, refusing to penetrate the leather fibers until they are warmed over a brazier. The cold adds hours of unseen labor to your daily quota, sabotaging your efficiency and threatening your precarious economic margins. You mentally sequence the tasks required to mitigate the frost, preparing a detailed strategy to conquer the hostile conditions the moment the sun finally appears. Your mind is a relentless engine of practical planning, unable to rest even when your body demands a reprieve. You hear your youngest child whimper softly from the sleeping pallet, a frail, unconscious protest against the biting chill. You stand up from the stool, your knee joints popping loudly in the hushed room, and move toward the huddled forms of your family. You crouch beside the mattress, running your hand over the top of the coarse wool blanket to ensure it remains tucked securely around their small shoulders. The fabric is rough and smells of lanolin, retaining a pocket of precious, fragile body heat that means the difference between survival and sickness. You rest your palm lightly against the child's back, feeling the rapid, bird-like thrum of a heartbeat, fighting to maintain its rhythm in the freezing air. You remain kneeling there for a long time, acting as a human shield against the invisible drafts, snake-crawling across the floor. You trace the outline of a repurposed Roman brick embedded in the wall near the hearth, the rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth, crumbling plaster. The fired clay bears the stamped insignia of a forgotten imperial legion, a ghostly fingerprint left behind by the men who conquered the known world. You share this cramped space with the ghosts of antiquity, repurposing their monumental achievements to prop up the sagging roof of a medieval tenement. The irony of this existence is profound. A civilization reduced to scavenging the bones of its ancestors just to survive the harsh Italian winter. You drag your fingernail along the groove of the ancient stamp, connecting your own calloused hand to the vanished laborers who pulled this brick from the kilns 1,000 years ago. The physical continuity of the city is written in dirt and fired earth. You listen to the distant, churning roar of the Tiber River, an aggressive, chaotic noise that refuses to diminish despite the late hour. The floodwaters are likely receding, but the current remains treacherous, carrying the shattered wreckage of floating mills and drowned livestock out toward the distant sea. The river is the untamed heart of the valley, a volatile artery that provides the essential water for tanning hides and grinding grain, while simultaneously demanding an annual tribute of destruction. You picture the muddy banks stripped bare by the deluge, the ancient retaining walls exposed and scoured clean by the abrasive force of the sediment. The geography of Rome is defined by this unpredictable waterway, forcing the inhabitants to build their lives around its dangerous, shifting moods. You detect the faint, musky scent of a feral cat prowling the narrow ledge outside your shuttered window. The animal pauses, its claws clicking softly against the frozen wood as it searches for a breach in the defenses of your larder. The urban scavengers are desperate in this weather, driven by a gnawing hunger that overrides their natural caution and forces them to take unprecedented risks. You rap your knuckles sharply against the inside of the timber shutter, producing a loud, hollow thud that startles the creature into an immediate retreat. The sudden silence that follows is heavy and absolute, leaving you alone once again in the suspended animation of the pre-dawn watch. You lean your forehead against the cold wood, the temperature of the timber shocking your tired skin. You consider the precarious state of the city's food supply, the anxiety tightening the muscles at the base of your neck. The destruction of the river mills will create an immediate bottleneck in the production of flour, allowing the opportunistic merchants near the Campo dei Fiori to inflate their prices without mercy. You know that the cost of a basic rye loaf will double before the end of the week, squeezing your household budget until it shatters. You will have to negotiate harder for your leather goods, demanding more silver from the wealthy stewards who guard the sprawling estates on the Quirinal Hill. The commerce of this era is a brutal, unyielding contest of wills, an economic battlefield where the penalty for losing is slow, quiet starvation. You visualize the fortified towers of the Frangipani and Orsini clans looming over the darkened skyline, their jagged silhouettes blending into the black clouds. The noble families are sleeping securely behind thick iron doors and dozens of armed retainers, insulated from the biting cold and the gnawing hunger of the artisan districts. The power dynamics of Rome are physical and absolute, measured in the height of defensive masonry and the number of swords a patron can command. You harbor no illusions about your place in this rigid hierarchy, accepting your status as a lowly craftsman with the weary pragmatism of a man who has seen too many rebellions crushed in blood. You navigate their territorial disputes like a man walking through a minefield, striving only to remain invisible and useful. You shift your thoughts to the crowded pilgrim hostels clustering near the great Basilica of St. Peter across the river. Hundreds of exhausted foreigners are currently shivering on thin straw pallets, their bodies racked with the preliminary stages of the endemic malarial fever. They have crossed continents to weep before the bones of martyrs, trading their health and their silver for a desperate chance at spiritual absolution. The economy of salvation drives the engine of the city, bringing a continuous stream of wealth and disease into the narrow, filthy streets. You respect their fierce devotion while quietly profiting from their need for durable boots and waterproof satchels, a symbiotic relationship built on faith and commerce. The city consumes their piety just as eagerly as it consumes the ancient marble. You wait for the tolling of the Laud's bells, the ecclesiastical signal that the deep night is finally surrendering its grip. The silence stretches out, an agonizing, unmeasured void that tests the limits of your solitary endurance. You focus on the microscopic details of the room to maintain your vigilance, studying the subtle variations in the darkness that separate the bulk of the table from the empty space of the floor. You monitor the steady respiration of your wife, learning the exact cadence of her breathing and noting any slight deviation that might signal a disturbing dream. The act of listening becomes an intense physical effort, a straining of the auditory nerves that leaves you feeling hollowed out and fragile. You are holding the line against the encroaching chaos, a silent guardian in a ruined world. You smell the distinct, layered aroma of the medieval metropolis, a complex olfactory tapestry woven into the fabric of your clothing. The sharp tang of the tannery chemicals mixes with the sour reek of the open street gutters, underscored by the pervasive, smoky scent of burned wood and rendered animal fat. This is the perfume of human struggle, the inescapable smell of thousands of bodies packed too tightly into an infrastructure designed for a different age. You inhale deeply, taking the foul air into your lungs without complaint, recognizing it as the atmosphere of home. The scent grounds you in the immediate reality of your situation, banishing any lingering illusions of comfort or escape. You belong to this dirt, this cold, and this unyielding stone. You run your hand along the edge of the wooden bench, feeling the uneven grain and the shallow gouges left by decades of utilitarian abuse. The furniture in this dwelling is crude and functional, built to withstand the heavy wear of a laboring family rather than to provide aesthetic pleasure. You trace the head of a rusted iron nail driven deep into the timber, the metal cold and rough against the sensitive pad of your index finger. The physical world is harsh and unpolished, demanding a thick skin and a resilient spirit from anyone hoping to survive its daily abrasions. You press your palm flat against the wood, anchoring yourself to the solid, tangible reality of the object beneath your hand. You summon the memory of the midday sun, a desperate mental exercise designed to combat the freezing temperature of the room. You picture the harsh golden light striking the cracked cobblestones, radiating a stifling heat that causes the air to shimmer and distort. You remember the sensation of sweat trailing down your spine, the heavy, oppressive humidity that usually plagues the river valley during the summer months. The recalled warmth is weak and fleeting, offering only a momentary distraction from the biting frost creeping up your legs. The physical reality of the cold is too powerful to ignore, a relentless adversary that requires constant movement and bank fires to defeat. You abandon the memory and pull your knees tighter against your chest, shivering violently in the dark. You pry the wooden shutter open a fraction of an inch, squinting through the narrow slit at the strip of sky visible above the neighboring roofline. The heavy storm clouds have finally broken, revealing a chaotic scattering of bright, hard stars burning in the frozen atmosphere. The constellations are sharp and unforgiving, offering no warmth or comfort to the shivering mortals trapped on the muddy earth below. You watch the slow, imperceptible rotation of the celestial bodies, tracking the passage of time without the aid of a mechanical clock or a ringing bell. The vast indifference of the universe is laid bare in that narrow, vertical slice of the heavens, a stark reminder of your own microscopic insignificance. You let the shutter close, retreating from the overwhelming scale of the night sky. You return your focus to the immediate neighborhood, analyzing the subtle acoustic clues that indicate the approaching dawn. The feral cats have ceased their desperate scavenging, seeking shelter from the plunging temperatures in the deep cellars of the abandoned baths. The wind has died down to a faint, erratic whisper, failing to rattle the heavy shutters or howl through the broken masonry. The absolute stillness is a characteristic of the final, darkest hour, a brief, suspended moment of total paralysis before the frantic machinery of the city grinds back into motion. You hold your breath, listening intently to the profound, terrifying silence that blankets the ruined capital, a quiet so deep it feels like physical pressure against your eardrums. You feel a sudden, sharp ache in your jaw, realizing you have been clenching your teeth tightly together to suppress your violent shivering. You force the muscles in your face to relax, exhaling a long, ragged breath that forms a thick white cloud in the freezing air. The physical toll the night watch is mounting rapidly, draining the last reserves of adrenaline and leaving you feeling brittle and exhausted. You know that sleep is impossible now, the proximity of the dawn demanding your continued alertness to manage the transition of the household. You must revive the dead fire, break the ice forming in the water bucket, and prepare the tools for another grueling day of artisan labor. The relentless cycle of work offers no leniency for fatigue. You reach out and touch the cold stone of the hearth, seeking the faint, residual warmth buried deep within the masonry. The bricks are freezing on the surface, entirely stripped of the heat generated by the evening fire. You trace the rough edge of the firebox, gathering a handful of the gray, powdery ash into your palm, feeling the dry, abrasive texture of the burned oak. The dust is all that remains of the fuel you sacrificed to hold back the dark, a physical representation of consumed energy and lost time. You let the ash sift slowly through your fingers, watching it fall back into the pile with a soft, whisper-quiet hiss. The act is a silent acknowledgement of the harsh, unyielding entropy that governs every aspect of your medieval existence. You map the twisting, labyrinthine route you will take to the tanner's pits later in the morning, anticipating the hazards left behind by the storm. You know, the lower sections of the street will be choked with deep, stagnant mud, requiring a detour through the narrow, treacherous alleys near the Theater of Marcellus. You mentally rehearse the negotiations, preparing the exact phrasing required to secure the necessary hides without surrendering too much of your hoarded silver. The mental exercise keeps your brain active, fending off the dangerous lethargy that threatens to shut down your cognitive functions in the extreme cold. You are a tactician of poverty, constantly maneuvering your limited resources against the overwhelming odds of the fractured city. You maintain your rigid posture on the wooden stool, refusing to surrender to the overwhelming desire to lie down on the freezing floor. The discipline required to sit upright is immense, drawing on a deep, stubborn reservoir of pride that refuses to break under the pressure of the elements. You are a craftsman of Rome, the inheritor of a shattered legacy tasked with keeping the blood pumping through the veins of a dying metropolis. You endure the darkness because endurance is the only skill that truly matters, the foundational requirement for every other achievement in this brutal era. The silence of the pre-dawn stretches out, an agonizing, unyielding test of your resolve. The unyielding test of your resolve begins to fracture as a subtle, nearly imperceptible shift alters the atmospheric pressure within the cramped room. You feel a sudden, sharp draft snake across the floorboards, carrying the distinct scent of frozen earth and distant river silt. The total opacity of the night thins marginally, trading the absolute blackness for a heavy, suffocating shade of charcoal gray. You exhale slowly, watching the faint plume of your own breath dissipate into the frigid air just inches from your face. The endurance required to maintain this vigil has hollowed out your chest, leaving behind a brittle, fragile exhaustion that must be carefully managed. The darkest hour has officially broken, yielding to the slow, agonizing machinery of the approaching dawn. You push yourself off the low wooden stool, your joints protesting with a chorus of sharp, localized aches that demand immediate attention. You stomp your thin leather shoes against the packed dirt to force the stagnant blood back into your numb toes, the dull thuds echoing softly. The cold has settled deep into the marrow of your bones, a pervasive chill that the thick woolen cloak can no longer adequately repel. You walk a tight, restless circle around the perimeter of the room, using the physical movement to generate a meager supply of internal heat. The physical maintenance of your own body is a relentless chore, requiring constant vigilance to prevent the damp Roman winter from inflicting permanent damage. A sudden metallic clatter from the alleyway below shatters the heavy silence, signaling the first stirrings of the city's vast working class. You approach the shuttered window and press your ear against the rough timber, listening intently to the harsh scraping of a heavy wooden cart navigating the treacherous, frost-heaved cobblestones. The driver mutters a string of coarse curses at his laboring beast, his voice thick with the universal weariness of men who toil before the sun rises. The bakers are moving their flour shipments, desperate to begin the morning's production despite the catastrophic damage to the floating mills on the Tiber. The economic engine of the metropolis grinds forward without mercy, ignoring the elements and the exhaustion of its human components. Outside the protective walls of your dwelling, the chaotic scene near the central market is already unfolding in the freezing gloom. The carcasses of slaughtered livestock will be stiff with frost, requiring heavy cleavers and significant physical force to separate the valuable cuts from the bone. You know that the competition for the freshest provisions will be fierce today, driven by the lingering panic caused by the sudden, violent autumn storm. The scarcity of resources breeds a quiet, desperate aggression among the populace, a constant underlying tension that dictates the rhythm of every commercial exchange. You are glad to be insulated from that immediate chaos, sequestered in the relative safety of your artisanal district. You turn your attention back to the stone hearth, kneeling on the cold bricks to assess the state of the banked embers you buried hours ago. You use a small iron poker to carefully scrape away the top layer of protective ash, revealing a faint, pulsing red glow hidden beneath the dust. The survival of the fire is a minor miracle of domestic engineering, sparing you the tedious and frustrating task of striking flint with frozen, clumsy fingers. You arrange a handful of dry twigs and a single piece of split oak over the coals, blowing a steady, targeted stream of air to encourage ignition. The wood catches with a sharp, welcome crackle, the nascent flame throwing long, dancing shadows across the uneven plaster walls. This sudden influx of light and heat alters the atmosphere of the dwelling, pushing back the oppressive cold and revealing the accumulated squalor of the confined space. You notice the dark, damp stains spreading across the ceiling, marking the exact paths where the heavy rain managed to penetrate the aging clay roof tiles. The floorboards are warped and uneven, bearing the scars of countless repairs in the continuous grinding wear of your family's daily existence. The visual reality of your poverty is stark and unavoidable in the flickering firelight, a constant reminder of the razor-thin margins that separate survival from ruin. You turn away from the structural decay, focusing instead on the tangible warmth radiating against your chilled shins. Your wife stirs on the sleeping pallet, coughing weakly into the coarse wool blanket as the changing temperature disturbs her fragile rest. You watch her pull the heavy fabric tight around the children, an unconscious maternal instinct that operates even in the depths of exhaustion. The respiratory ailments of the medieval winter are a constant lurking threat, exacerbated by the lack of proper ventilation and the pervasive indoor wood smoke. You pour a small amount of the murky well water into a wooden cup, placing it near the edge of the mattress for when she inevitably wakes with a parched throat. The silent, preventative care you offer is the only medicine available, a desperate attempt to ward off the fevers that claim so many lives in this damp river valley. You retrieve a stiff brush made of bound boar bristles from the tool chest, preparing to groom the heavy woolen garments that sustained you through the night. You scrub the coarse fabric vigorously, dislodging the dried mud in the pervasive soot that coats everything within the urban boundaries. The repetitive motion generates a satisfying friction, working the stiffness out of your shoulders while simultaneously restoring a small measure of dignity to your worn clothing. The maintenance of appearances, however crude, is a necessary defense against the societal contempt directed at the poorest laborers of the city. You shake the clean tunic out, the fabric smelling sharply of lanolin and the acrid smoke of the newly revived hearth. A faint silvery illumination begins to bleed through the horizontal cracks in the window shutters, a cold and uncompromising precursor to the actual dawn. The bruised purple of the night sky is yielding to a flat, featureless expanse of slate gray, revealing the sharp, jagged silhouettes of the surrounding noble towers. You know that the guards stationed on those high parapets are currently blowing on their hands and stamping their feet, eager for their brutal watch to end. The architectural dominance of the patrician class is absolute, casting long, literal shadows over the cramped, twisting alleys of the artisan districts below. The city is a vertical hierarchy of stone and power, with your own existence relegated firmly to the mud and the shadows at the base. You hear the sharp, rhythmic ringing of a blacksmith's hammer striking cold iron, the sound cutting cleanly through the crisp, pre-dawn air. The heavy, metallic thuds originate from a forge 2 streets over, indicating that the most demanding physical labor of the day has already commenced. The smiths are capitalizing on the low ambient temperatures, using the natural chill to temper their newly forged tools before the heat of the day compromises the process. The industrial heartbeat of Rome is waking up, a localized cacophony of scraping, hammering, and shouting that signals the end of the nocturnal paralysis. You roll your shoulders back, anticipating the familiar ache that will soon settle into your own muscles. You move to the wooden storage chest and withdraw a thick leather apron, the surface scarred and stained by years of exposure to harsh tanning chemicals. You pull the heavy garment over your head and tie the rawhide laces securely behind your back, the stiff material acting as a flexible armor against the hazards of your trade. The apron smells strongly of rendered fat and ammonia, a pungent, unavoidable perfume that identifies your profession to anyone within a 10-foot radius. You adjust the fit to ensure maximum mobility, knowing that the intricate cutting and stamping required today will demand unrestricted movement of your arms and torso. The donning of the work gear is a solemn daily ritual, a physical transition from the vulnerable state of rest to the armored reality of the workbench. By the time the distant overlapping chorus of church bells finally shatters the relative quiet, an aggressive and discordant announcement of the Lord's hour rings out. The bronze notes roll across the rooftops in chaotic, unsynchronized waves, a relentless auditory assault that demands immediate conscious attention from the waking populace. You bow your head in a brief, habitual gesture of reverence, acknowledging the stern authority of the ecclesiastical calendar over the structure of your day. The bells serve as the ultimate, inescapable timepiece, dictating the opening of the markets, the unsealing of the city gates, and the commencement of official commerce. The spiritual and the practical are inextricably linked, bound together by the resonant ringing that echoes through the ancient ruined forums. Beyond the thin walls, the heavy wooden bar slides back on the door of the adjacent tenement, followed by the slop of a bucket being emptied directly into the central gutter. The foul odor of human waste permeates the alley instantly, mixing with the frigid air to create a nauseating sensory alarm for the neighborhood. The lack of proper sanitation remains a grim, accepted reality, a continuous source of disease that the municipal authorities are woefully ill-equipped to manage. You wrinkle your nose in disgust, grateful that the freezing temperatures will at least suppress the worst of the summer miasmas. The filth of the city stands as an ever-present adversary, requiring constant, exhausting vigilance to keep the immediate boundaries of your household relatively clean. You step toward the heavy oak door leading down to the workshop, your hand resting firmly on the cold iron latch. The day stretches out before you, a long, unbroken expanse of physical exertion, meticulous craftsmanship, and constant, underlying economic anxiety. You draw a deep breath of the stale, smoky air, filling your lungs with the familiar atmosphere of survival and grim determination. The transition from the passive defense of the night watch to the active engagement of the artisanal trade is complete. You press down on the latch, the loud metallic clack signaling your steadfast readiness to face whatever challenges the ruined, magnificent city intends to throw at you. You turn away from the heavy oak door, the adrenaline that sustained you through the perilous night finally evaporating into the frigid air. A hollow exhaustion settles into the marrow of your bones, making the simple act of standing feel like a monumental achievement. The muscles in your legs tremble, registering the cumulative strain of the violent storm, the plunging temperatures, and the ceaseless vigilance. You drag your feet across the packed dirt floor of the workshop, every step requiring a deliberate command to your depleted nervous system. The scattered iron tools and half-finished leather harnesses can wait until the sun climbs higher, as your physical limits have been thoroughly breached. The transition from active defense to passive surrender begins the moment you release the iron latch and step away from the workbench. Light creeps through the narrow cracks in the wooden shutters, casting pale, dusty beams across the scarred surface of your artisan station. The iron awls and curved knives seem to blur at the edges, your vision swimming from the intense lack of rest over the past 12 hours. A distant hammer rings out from the neighboring forge, but the metallic strike feels muted and far away, disconnected from your immediate reality. You strip the heavy leather apron from your shoulders, the stiff material hitting the floor with a dull, heavy slap that stirs the dust. The pungent odor of tanning liquor and rendered fat clings to the coarse wool of your tunic, a permanent perfume marking your demanding trade. This small, shadowed room holds the raw materials that will eventually secure another week of survival, but its demands must now be ignored. You climb the narrow wooden stairs with agonizing effort, gripping the rough plaster wall to maintain your uncertain balance on the uneven treads. The living quarters above are suffused with the pale, anemic glow of the early morning, revealing the stark poverty of the domestic space in unsparing detail. Your wife stands near the hearth, storing a small pot of grain over the newly revived fire, her face lined with the shared fatigue of the Roman winter. She glances up as you enter, reading the absolute depletion in your posture without needing to exchange a single spoken word. A silent agreement passes between you, acknowledging that the burden of the morning routine must shift entirely to her capable shoulders. You move past the scarred table, your destination, the low straw pallet that represents the only available sanctuary in the crowded dwelling. Smoke drifts lazily from the small firebox, carrying the sharp, woody scent of burning oak into the cold, damp air filtering through the unsealed roof. You collapse onto the edge of the mattress, the dry straw ticking, protesting loudly under your sudden, unresisting weight. The rough texture of the fabric bites into the exposed skin of your wrists, a grounding sensation that anchors you to the physical world while your mind detaches. You pull the heavy leather turn shoes from your aching feet, tossing them carelessly onto the uneven floorboards with a pair of hollow thuds. The cold immediately attacks your bare toes, a biting reminder of the frost that still coats the cobblestones in the alleyway below the window. You swing your legs onto the bed, ignoring the cramped dimensions of the sleeping space in your desperate pursuit of unconsciousness. You pull the coarse wool blanket up to your chin, shivering as the chilled fabric saps the last remnants of your localized body heat. The material is heavy and smells faintly of damp sheep, a dense, suffocating layer that provides the only available defense against the winter drafts snaking across the floor. You curl into a tight ball, drawing your knees up towards your chest to minimize the surface area exposed to the freezing room. The muscles in your lower back throb with a persistent ache, the legacy of sitting on the hard wooden stool throughout the grueling night watch. You attempt to banish the swirling, chaotic images of the flooded Tiber and the shattered floating mills from behind your eyelids. The city outside continues to wake, a vast, indifferent machine that grinds forward regardless of your personal exhaustion. Outside the timber walls, the chaotic symphony of the morning market begins to build in intensity, vibrating through the ancient masonry. The wooden wheels of heavy carts grind against the uneven paving stones, a harsh, scraping noise that rattles the foundation of the tenement. Vendors shout their wares in the coarse local dialect, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence designed to cut through the ambient din. You hear the sharp crack of a drover's whip, followed by the frightened bleating of a sheep being herded toward the butcher's block on the Campo Vaccino. The daily struggle for commerce and sustenance is a relentless tide, sweeping the inhabitants of Rome into its current the moment the sun breaches the horizon. You lie still on the ticking, allowing the sounds to wash over you without triggering the usual anxious, adrenaline-fueled response. You banish the oppressive reality of the Roman food supply from your mind, forcing away a fleeting worry about the soaring cost of milled flour. You refuse to picture the ruined mills tumbling in the muddy water, the heavy grindstones sinking into the silt at the bottom of the river channel. The mental calculation of your remaining silver coins attempts to begin automatically, an ingrained habit forged by decades of living on the precipice of starvation. You consciously relax the tight muscles in your jaw and release the tension coiled in your neck, denying the financial anxiety any purchase in your thoughts. The economic survival of the family is a terrifying puzzle, but it cannot be solved from the confines of this shadowed straw mattress. You surrender the responsibility to the coming hours, accepting that the present moment requires nothing but absolute stillness. You feel the masonry walls of the dwelling exude a penetrating chill that battles constantly with the localized heat of the small fire across the room. This building is a patchwork of necessity, constructed from scavenged bricks and chunks of travertine liberated from the decaying imperial monuments surrounding the neighborhood. The ancient mortar still holds the uneven stones together with an obstinate grip that defies the relentless Roman damp and the shifting earth. You sense the deep grooves and chipped edges of the repurposed materials through the thin straw ticking pressing firmly against your spine. The history of the empire is embedded in the structure of your home, reducing the grand architectural ambitions of the past to the utilitarian survival of the present. The stones offer no comfort, only the stark reality of shelter against an indifferent, unfeeling sky. You rub your calloused hands together beneath the heavy blanket, feeling the abrasive friction of the thick skin and the permanent stains of the tanning dye. The joints in your fingers throb with a gnawing ache, the inevitable consequence of gripping tight iron tools and pulling heavy linen thread for endless hours. You massage the base of your thumb, attempting to work the stiffness out of the muscle before the rest can permanently lock the overworked tendons. The physical maintenance of your own body is a critical daily task, an absolute requirement for ensuring tomorrow's productivity in the workshop below. The wear and tear on your frame is a physical ledger, recording the exact cost of keeping your family fed and sheltered in this brutal era. You let your hands fall unmoving by your sides, the dull pain fading into a manageable background hum. You inhale the scent of the room, a complex tapestry woven from the distinct, localized odors of medieval domestic life, trapped within four walls. The sharp tang of the tannery chemicals mixed into your skin competes with the sour reek of the open street gutters filtering through the cracks in the shutters. The pervasive, smoky scent of burned wood and rendered animal fat forms the base note of this atmospheric, historical perfume. This is the aroma of human struggle, the inescapable smell of bodies packed too tightly into an infrastructure designed for a completely different age. You accept the foul air without complaint, recognizing it as the atmosphere of home, sanctuary, and continued existence. The scent grounds you in the immediate reality of your situation, banishing any lingering illusions of luxury or escape from your station. You ignore a sudden frantic scuttling sound erupting from the darkness behind the heavy grain sacks, followed by the high-pitched squeak of a territorial dispute. The vermin of Rome are as numerous and resilient as the human population, infesting the ancient ruins and the medieval tenements with equal unyielding enthusiasm. You trust your wife to defend the edible provisions stored in the heavy clay amphorae, relinquishing your role as the primary guardian of the larder. The mice are a constant threat to the limited food supply, but the responsibility for their eradication no longer falls upon your weary, aching shoulders. The city is a shared ecosystem, a hostile environment where every species competes fiercely for the meager resources left behind by the vanished empire. You focus your attention inward, detaching from the minor, localized disturbances of the room. The light filtering through the window shutters shifts from a pale, anemic gray to a warmer golden hue as the sun climbs higher above the coronal hill. The dust motes suspended in the air dance in the narrow beams, tracing chaotic, swirling patterns across the dim, shadowed interior. You watch the microscopic particles drift and collide, a mesmerizing visual display that requires no mental effort to comprehend or categorize. The illumination reveals the uneven texture of the plastered ceiling, where generations of inhabitants have patched the crumbling masonry with crude mixtures of mud and lime. The visual reality of your poverty is stark and unavoidable, a constant reminder of the razor-thin margins that separate survival from ruin in this river valley. You let your eyelids droop, the heavy lashes blurring the harsh details of the room into muted, indistinct forms. You listen as the heavy oak door of the tenement groans on its iron hinges, the wood swelling slightly from the moisture carried on the morning wind. You hear the rhythmic scraping of a broom against the packed dirt floor as your wife begins the arduous process of sweeping away the accumulated soot and debris. The repetitive shushing sound is a familiar, comforting lullaby, a testament to the enduring resilience of the women who hold the fragmented society together. The domestic tasks never truly end, blending seamlessly into the daylight hours until the darkness demands an absolute halt to all productive activity once again. The structure of the day is built upon these endless, uncelebrated chores, a foundation of labor that supports the fragile existence of the entire household. You sink deeper into the mattress, the sounds of the sweeping fading into the distance. You sense a subtle, microscopic shift in the barometric pressure, a heaviness in the air that suggests the remaining storm clouds are finally breaking apart overhead. The atmospheric change is a physical sensation, a slight release of tension that allows your contracted muscles to finally uncoil and stretch along the ticking. The cold draft snaking across the floorboards seems to lose its biting edge, the freezing temperatures blunted by the advancing heat of the morning sun baking the roof tiles. The physical compromises demanded by this existence are endless, a continuous negotiation between competing miseries that defines the medieval experience for the laboring class. You accept the slight improvement in the weather with weary gratitude, a minor victory in the unending war against the elements and the environment. The transition from waking consciousness to the shadowed realm of sleep accelerates, pulling you downward into the dark. The specific scrape of frost forming on the inside of the window glass marks the boundary between the warm interior and the freezing alley. The faint smell of tallow smoke clings stubbornly to the fibers of the wool blanket pressing against your chin. The unhurried, deep groan of the house timbers contracting in the cold echoes through the plaster walls. The exact sound of the embers shifting from red to dull gray in the hearth punctuates the stillness of the room. The precise weight of the heavy fabric anchors your exhausted limbs to the straw ticking. The distant sound of a draft horse shifting its hooves against the cobblestones drifts up from the street below. The rhythm of your own pulse thrums steadily in the sensitive hollow behind your ear. You let the world beyond this narrow bed dissolve into a collection of muted vibrations and fading scents that no longer demand your attention. The sanctuary of the mattress claims the last reserves of your physical awareness, demanding the total surrender of your waking mind to the void. The relentless machinery of Rome will continue to turn, grinding grain, forging iron, and moving silver, but you are no longer a part of its turning wheels. The night watch is finished, the storm has survived, and the debt of labor has been paid in full for this brief, suspended moment. The long descent into the dark brings the only true peace available in this ruined, magnificent capital, a rest earned through sweat, vigilance, and unbreakable endurance. The chill of the winter morning fades beneath the heavy weight of the spun wool. You close your eyes. Sleep now. These forgotten worlds will be waiting whenever you return.